Hey guys, tonight we step into a chilling tale of supernatural horror. Imagine this a long-forgotten hotel tucked away at the edge of a quiet town. It's been years since anyone last spoke of it, but its reputation still lingers like the dust in the air that never settles. One room. Room 428 has become the stuff of legend. The door hasn't been opened in over a decade yet. They say it calls out to those brave or foolish enough to stay the night. But be warned, what lies behind that door is no ordinary room. It's a place where time doesn't behave, and the shadows have a life of their own. There's a certain weight in the air, a tension that grows as you move closer. You've been warned. You probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The small town of Ashford had always been quiet, its days marked by a peaceful routine, until the hotel came into the picture. The building itself sat at the far edge of town, hidden behind a veil of overgrown ivy, like an abandoned relic of a time long past. At one point, it had been bustling with guests offering a brief stay for weary travelers passing through, but now it stood empty. Its weathered sign hung crookedly, barely visible, but those who still remembered the place often spoke in hushed tones of its infamous reputation. And yet, the door to room 428 remained locked, unopened. It had been for years, maybe longer. They said that whoever had once stayed in that room never left. No one was ever quite the same afterward. Jack had heard the stories. He'd grown up in Ashford and had listened to the older folks speak of the place with fear in their voices. But Jack wasn't one to be intimidated by tales of ghosts and curses. He'd dismissed it all as local superstition, just stories designed to keep curious minds away. He was wrong. It was a crisp fall evening when Jack finally decided to check in. He had been passing through Ashford, his car broken down, and nowhere to be found in terms of nearby repair shops. The motel he had stopped at was worn and clearly in need of repairs, but it had a certain charm, the kind that only old, tired buildings had. He was greeted by a gruff man behind the desk, who didn't seem particularly interested in Jack's arrival. The man barely made eye contact and handed over the key to room 428 without a word. At first, Jack was confused. Room 428. He had assumed all the rooms in the back of the building were closed for repairs, but there it was the key in his hand. The man only said one thing before Jack turned to leave. "You don't want to stay in that room." "Trust me." Jack scoffed. A warning. How quaint. His curiosity piqued, but he didn't think much of it. What harm could a room, however mysterious, really do? He made his way down the narrow corridor, the worn carpet beneath his feet creaking with each step. The walls, aged and yellowed, were adorned with faded paintings of landscapes he'd never seen, and the dim lighting cast shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The air smelled musty damp, like an old book left to rot in an attic. When he reached the door to room 428, he hesitated for just a moment. There was something odd about it, something wrong, in the way the door seemed to almost pulse, as though it were alive, breathing in time with his own anxious breaths. He inserted the key into the lock, and with a creak of the hinges, the door swung open. The room was dark, the heavy curtains drawn tightly over the windows. Jack flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The only sound was the faint hum of the building itself, a low, almost imperceptible vibration beneath his feet. He stepped inside the air cooler than the hallway. He could almost feel the weight of it, the suffocating presence of something unseen. The bed in the center of the room was unmade, the sheets tangled in knots as though someone had just risen from it, but no one had been there. Jack moved closer to the bed, eyeing the old cracked nightstand beside it. A thin layer of dust covered the surface, But what caught his attention was the framed photograph sitting next to the lamp. A photograph of the hotel with guests smiling in front of the grand doors, their faces frozen in time. He stared at the photo for a moment, the dim light of the lamp casting eerie shadows across the faces. Then something caught his eye just behind the smiling guests in the darkened corner of the photograph. A shape, a shadow, a figure that shouldn't have been there. Jack blinked, his heart racing in his chest. He squinted, but when he looked again, the figure was gone. Maybe it was a trick of the light. Maybe the photo was just old, the exposure imperfect. He turned away from the photo, feeling uneasy. He had never been one to be scared easily. But something about this place, about this room, made him feel watched. It wasn't a thought he could push away. It was a deep gnawing feeling, like fingers brushing against the back of his neck. The room felt colder. He turned toward the window and reached for the curtain, pulling it back with a sharp motion. The view outside was obscured by mist-thick fog, clung to the ground like a blanket, muffling any sound from outside, trapping the silence inside the room. Suddenly, a loud bang came from behind him. Jack whipped around, his heart in his throat. The door was swinging open, but there was no one there. He stepped toward the door cautiously, his feet hesitant on the creaking floorboards, his body frozen in place. The door hadn't slammed on its own. It had been forced open. There was no wind, no draft. He could hear something too. A faint raspy sound that seemed to be coming from behind the walls. Or was it the floor? It sounded like someone whispering, "Leave, leave before it's too late." The whisper was barely audible, a breath on the wind. It wasn't real, he told himself. It couldn't be, but the chill in the room thickened a cold that seeped into his bones. And deep down, Jack knew whatever lingered in room 428 wasn't just the wind. It was alive, it was waiting, and it wasn't letting him leave. Jack stood frozen in the middle of the room, his heart hammering against his chest as the silence pressed in on him. The door that had just slammed open still stood ajar, its frame dark and menacing, as if it were daring him to look through it. His hands, still trembling from the sudden shock, hung loosely at his sides. He had never been one to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, curses, haunted rooms. They were all just stories, weren't they? But now, standing in this room, room 428, Jack wasn't so sure anymore. The air was thick with tension. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing around him as he turned his gaze toward the nightstand where the photograph had been. His breath hitched. The image of the hotel's smiling guests was still there, but the figure he had seen earlier, the shadow, the indistinct shape, was gone. Just like before, he forced himself to take a step forward, but the floor creaked an almost mocking sound beneath the weight of his shoes. It wasn't just the room. The whole building was like this, old, forgotten, unsettled. Get it together, Jack told himself. It's just an old building. The door was probably loose. The floorboards groaned. His mind was racing, trying to rationalize what had happened, but this room refused to let him. The air had changed. The walls felt too close, and the light dim, as it was seemed to flicker in a way that was too rhythmic, too deliberate. He stepped closer to the open door, but the weight in the room pushed against him, keeping him rooted to the spot. That's when he heard it again, a faint rustling sound. It came from behind him. Not a whisper this time, but something more distinct, something moving. He didn't have to turn around to know it wasn't just his imagination. He could feel it, like the temperature had dropped just enough to make his breath visible in the air. The feeling of being watched was stronger than before, creeping up his spine like a cold hand. Jack glanced over his shoulder, his neck stiff with tension. Nothing. The room was still. The only sound was the faint hum of electricity, the soft buzz of the dying light bulb overhead. But then it came again. A soft, deliberate tap, 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 slow and rhythmic, coming from somewhere deeper in the room. The closet. Jack's eyes shot to the corner of the room where the old wooden closet door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning him closer. The taps grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was trying to get his attention. His heart skipped a beat. His body screamed at him to leave, to run, to escape, before whatever was in that closet reached out to him, but his feet wouldn't obey. It was as if the room had a magnetic pull keeping him locked in place. With a shaky breath, Jack forced himself to move toward the closet. The tap, tap, tap continued steady and unnerving. His fingers brushed the door cold and smooth beneath his touch. As he pulled it open, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. A gust of cold air rushed past him, and for a moment he thought he heard something moving within the closet. He didn't want to look, but he had no choice. The closet was empty. Nothing inside it but a faded coat rack, long abandoned and covered in dust. The tapping had stopped, but the room felt no less heavy. There was a pressure now, like the entire building was holding its breath, waiting for something. Jack let out a slow breath, trying to regain some semblance of calm. He stepped back, the weight in his chest lingering. The closet door swung gently on its hinges, as if someone had just touched it. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut. The force of it made him jump back, his heart leaping into his throat. Jack's breath caught in his chest. The room felt as if it were alive, as if the walls were drawing closer, the darkness thickening around him. The temperature had dropped so low that he could see his breath like smoke swirling in the still air. His body was frozen, every nerve on high alert, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get out of the room. But his legs wouldn't move. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely. Complete darkness. Jack's heart pounded in his ears, a heavy thrum that seemed to echo in the silence. His hands fumbled at his side, feeling for his phone, but his fingers were numb. The air felt suffocating, thick with a presence he could no longer deny. A faint creak broke the silence coming from the bed, the same bed that had been unmade earlier, the same bed that had looked so innocent. Now it was moving. The blanket shifted slowly at first, then more violently, as if something beneath it were shifting, moving with deliberate slowness. Jack's breath hitched. His body was shaking, paralyzed, as the bed groaned with the weight of whatever was beneath the sheets, and then a low, guttural whisper curled through the darkness. "I see you." Jack's heart stopped. The room was suffocating now, the walls pressing in like they were alive, the shadows growing longer and darker, pushing against him from every direction. "I see you. Come closer." The voice was soft, but its command was unmistakable. Jack didn't know how he managed it, but his feet moved, his legs stiff and reluctant. Every step toward the bed felt like he was walking into something he couldn't control, a force much stronger than his will. Something was under that bed, but as his hand reached for the blanket, something moved. A figure tall and thin emerged from the shadows, its shape barely discernible in the darkness. Its eyes gleamed faintly, like twin orbs of light, but their glow was unnatural, like the reflection of light on glass, cold and empty. It smiled. A wide, unsettling grin that spread across its face, too wide, too stretched, as if it were never meant to be there. Its teeth were long, sharp, and jagged, gleaming in the darkness. And the last thing Jack heard before everything went black was the voice, low and mocking. "Welcome home." Claire's eyes snapped open, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she bolted upright, her hands scrambling in the dark to find any solid surface. The air around her was thick, suffocating, as though she was still trapped inside room 428. For a moment she couldn't tell if she was still dreaming, or if this was some extension of the nightmare that had plagued her from the moment she stepped foot in that forsaken hotel. But then the weight of reality settled in. She was no longer in the room. She was sitting on the cold floor of a new, unfamiliar space. Her hands gripped the edge of a wooden table, the rough surface beneath her palms grounding her to the present. Her heart raced, each beat echoing in her ears, the remnants of fear still pulsing through her veins. She slowly took in her surroundings, nothing but blackness. The room was pitch dark, the air colder than it should have been for a room that had no reason to be so freezing. She could hear the faint, low hum of electricity flickering somewhere in the distance. Her mind swirled with questions, but one word rose above the rest. Why? Her surroundings were unfamiliar, yet somehow they felt disturbingly familiar. The same sense of isolation she had felt in the hotel lingered. The same feeling of being watched, of being trapped inside something she could not escape. Her hands trembled as she pulled herself up to her feet. Every part of her body felt heavy, sluggish, like her muscles were wading through thick water. But she wasn't about to stop. Not now. Her feet shuffled across the cold floor, each step hesitant, the darkness around her like an oppressive fog that threatened to suffocate her with every passing second. She felt along the walls, trying to find a door, a window, anything that could lead her to the light. She turned the corner, her fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface of the wall. The air was thick here, the scent of old wood, stale air, and dust clinging to her like a shroud. And then the sound, a soft scraping like metal against stone. Claire froze, her heart slamming against her ribs as the noise grew louder. It was close. Too close. The sound continued, steady and relentless, as if something or someone was moving through the darkness toward her. Don't turn around, just keep moving forward. Her breath hitched as she forced herself to keep walking, to ignore the noise that seemed to follow her every step. She couldn't let herself stop. The room was closing in on her again, the shadows pulling at her ankles, the very air thick with the weight of whatever was behind her. It's not real. It's not real. You're not in the hotel. You're not there anymore. But that same creeping sense of presence was returning. The suffocating darkness from room 428, the whispers, the figure that had reached for her in that room, they were here now too. She couldn't see them, but she felt them. Her pulse quickened and she turned her head just slightly to see if there was anything in the darkness behind her. And there it was, the figure. A tall silhouette, its outline barely visible in the shadow, but unmistakable. It was just standing there, watching her, waiting. Its presence weighed on her chest, pressing against her lungs, making it harder and harder to breathe. Her legs were frozen in place. She couldn't move. The room seemed to tilt the walls, bending in on her. No, no, no. She thought, desperately trying to move her feet. But they wouldn't respond. The darkness was too strong. The figure's eyes, those empty, glowing pits, seemed to pull her in, drawing her closer. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and the room seemed to shift, warping and pulling toward the thing that now stood just inches from her. Claire felt her skin crawl as the air around her grew colder. The thing's presence enveloped her. It was suffocating, consuming. "You cannot escape." The voice was a low growl, rasping in her ears, and Claire felt herself being pulled toward it, the weight of its words wrapping around her like chains. She tried to fight it, to break free, but the darkness tightened, wrapping around her body, pulling her into its cold, infinite depths. Just as the figure reached out for her, its long, claw-like fingers grazing her cheek, Claire snapped back to reality. She gasped as she shot up from her lying position, her body slick with sweat, her hands trembling in the air as if grasping for something that wasn't there. She was back in room 428. No, her chest heaved, her pulse erratic, as her mind scrambled to understand what had just happened. Was it a dream? Had she been transported somewhere? Or was this all part of the nightmare she couldn't escape? Claire's heart continued to race as she took in her surroundings. This room, this place had been where it had all started, but it didn't feel like it was just the same room. It was different now, darker, alive. The floorboards creaked under her feet, the dust in the air swirling like ghosts around her. The dim light from the flickering bulb above cast eerie shadows across the walls, making everything feel off-kilter, like she was walking through a distorted version of the world she once knew. Her body moved on its own accord. She couldn't control it, not when she was so caught in the pull of whatever dark force had claimed this room. She moved to the center of the room and looked down at the floor, her eyes drawn to something glistening there, a small puddle of water. No, not water, something darker, blacker with a slick sheen to it. The puddle stretched toward the bed, and something shifted within it, like a reflection of a face that wasn't hers. Claire recoiled, her mind spinning. No. Not again, she whispered under her breath. Not here. Not now. But the room wasn't letting her go. The whispers had returned louder, clearer, pressing into her thoughts like 1,000 voices in a chorus. You will always come back. She didn't know what had happened. Didn't know if this was part of the same dream or something worse. But she knew one thing for sure. Now the hotel room 428, it had followed her. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how hard she tried, the darkness would always find her. She was never truly free. Claire's body felt numb as she stood in the center of the room, her heart racing. The room 428, was suffocating alive with a presence that clung to every inch of air around her. The whispers had returned, curling through her thoughts like tendrils of smoke, making it harder and harder to think clearly. The puddle of dark liquid on the floor glistened beneath her, its surface like an oily mirror reflecting something that wasn't there. Her hands trembled, and she wiped them against her jeans, trying to rid herself of the cold sweat that had soaked through her clothes. The room felt like it was closing in its walls, pressing inward with a pressure that grew with every breath she took. The floorboards beneath her feet creaked with each movement, as if the building itself were alive watching her. The whispers grew louder. They weren't just in her mind anymore. They were around her, filling the air, slithering into every corner. She could feel them. The shadows seemed to grow longer, darker, stretching toward her, like they had minds of their own. The room was alive, and it wanted her. You cannot leave. Her legs felt like lead, each step heavier than the last, but she forced herself to move, her eyes darting around the room. The walls seemed to shift in the dim light, the faded wallpaper peeling away like skin, revealing dark, rotting wood beneath. The bed in the corner of the room had grown darker, as though it were soaking in the very essence of the place. It seemed to draw her in like the eyes of something waiting patiently to devour her. Claire turned away from the bed, her pulse spiking as she searched for a way out. The door was still there, but it wasn't the same. The handle glimmered in the dim light, but it seemed unreachable, as though it were an illusion, a dream that she could never grasp. The figure in the corner of the room shifted its outline, a blur, but Claire could feel it. It was watching her, waiting. The air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping as though the room itself had become a vacuum. She could see her breath now, the cold swirling in the air like smoke. She backed away from the corner, but the figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was already there, surrounding her, closing in. It was in the shadows. It was in the very fabric of the room, in every crack in the walls, in every creak of the floor beneath her. You belong to us. The voice was softer now, like a lullaby, but there was no comfort in it. There was only cold. Claire's hand brushed against the edge of the nightstand as she moved toward the door. But the moment her fingers touched the wood, something shifted. The air grew heavier, the shadows deeper, and her body froze, trapped between the door and the growing darkness. The room seemed to contract, suffocating her in its grip, until she thought she might suffocate right there in the center of the room. But then she heard it, an unmistakable sound. the soft creak of the floor behind her followed by a slow, dragging noise, as though something or someone was moving toward her. Claire's stomach turned and she spun around to face the sound, her body trembling uncontrollably. The figure, it was moving now. Slowly, deliberately, it took one step after another, dragging its body across the floor like something broken, something that didn't belong. The darkness seemed to swirl around it, encasing it in a fog that made it even harder to make out its true form. The figure's eyes gleamed in the shadows, two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through her very soul. "We are waiting for you." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command, a promise like the truth she had been trying to deny. She had never left. She had never escaped. The figure took another step and the shadows closed in, swallowing the room whole. Claire stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest as the darkness pressed against her, suffocating her. She had to get out. She had to leave. But the door, the exit, was too far. The shadows were closing in, and she could feel the weight of them pulling her toward the figure that now stood only feet away. The door was within her reach. It had to be, but as she reached for it, the room twisted. The walls warped, bending inward like the jaws of a predator, and the figure stepped forward. Its cold hand outstretched its fingers, long and twisted. "You will never escape," Claire's mind screamed. She could feel the terror gripping her heart, but she refused to give in. She had faced it before. She had broken free once. She could do it again. With a final surge of energy, Claire flung herself at the door, her fingers wrapping around the cold handle, pulling it open with all her might. And just as she felt the first rush of air from the hallway, just as she thought she might escape a force, the force tore her back. "You belong here." Her body was yanked back, her feet skidding across the floor as the door slammed shut behind her. The shadows closed in, swallowing her whole. Claire's head spun as the shadows engulfed her, the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. Her body jerked violently, as though something unseen was pulling at her very soul, dragging her deeper into the room. Her hands shot out to grab the doorframe, but the force was too strong, and she was flung backward, crashing into the bed. The moment she hit the mattress, the room seemed to shift again, distorting like a funhouse mirror. The walls pressed closer, the ceiling lowering the air, becoming thick and stifling. The whispers were back louder now, a deafening cacophony that drowned out her thoughts. "You belong to us." The words echoed in her mind, wrapping around her, tightening like a noose. The room felt alive, the very fabric of it breathing, pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Claire's vision blurred as the shadows swirled around her, blocking out everything but the figure. It was closer now, standing at the foot of the bed, its dark form looming over her like a predator about to strike. Claire could feel its eyes on her, those cold, empty pits that burned with an otherworldly light. The presence was suffocating its weight, crushing her chest, making it harder to breathe. The figure moved its limbs, bending in unnatural angles, twisting, as if it were made of smoke and shadows. The room seemed to respond, the walls groaning, as if the building itself was reacting to the presence in the room. The floor beneath Claire's feet began to vibrate, the sensation crawling through her bones. Her mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to push herself up, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as though her limbs had turned to stone, her muscles frozen in place. She was trapped. The figure leaned closer, its presence overwhelming, filling every inch of space. Its voice was a low growl, a rasping sound that sent chills down her spine. "You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are ours." Claire's pulse raced, the whispers growing louder, their voices overlapping, blending into a twisted song of despair. "You are ours. You cannot leave. You belong to us." Her mind screamed, but no sound escaped her lips. She could feel the figure's cold breath on her face, its presence wrapping around her, suffocating her. It reached out with one long, twisted hand, its fingers like skeletal claws, and Claire instinctively recoiled. But there was nowhere to go. The room had become a prison, the walls closing in the shadows, swallowing her whole. No, not again. Her heart pounded in her chest as her mind raced. She couldn't go back to that place. She couldn't be consumed by the darkness again. With a sudden burst of strength, Claire forced herself to move. She scrambled, her hands gripping the edge of the bed as she pushed herself upward. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows reaching for her, but she fought back with every ounce of strength she had left. Her body screamed in protest, her muscles protesting, but she couldn't stop. She had to get out. She had to leave. The bed creaked as she staggered to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. She was dizzy, her vision flickering, but she didn't stop. The door was still there, but it seemed so far away, as if the room had stretched, pulling the exit further out of reach. The figure moved again, its form flickering in and out of existence like a shadow in the dark. It was so close now, just a few feet away, its cold fingers reaching out for her. She could feel the darkness closing in the air, growing colder as it consumed the room. You cannot escape. But Claire couldn't stop. She couldn't let it win. She reached for the door, her hands trembling, and with a desperate wrench, she pulled it open. For a moment, the light from the hallway flooded into the room, chasing away the shadows. The air felt fresher, lighter, and for the briefest moment, Claire thought she was free. But just as quickly, the door slammed shut behind her. The darkness didn't retreat. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You cannot leave. You are ours." Claire's mind spun as she stood in the hallway, her body trembling with fear. She could feel the cold of the room still clinging to her, like a lingering touch that refused to let go. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in the air, thick with the weight of the hotel's presence. She turned, but the hallway seemed to be different now. The walls had become distorted, warped like the hotel was shifting, bending to its own will. The door to room 428 was still there, standing at the end of the hallway, but now it was closed. The figure was no longer in the room, but she could still feel it, watching her, waiting. The shadows crept down the hallway, curling around her feet, making it impossible to move forward. The whispers continued, growing louder as if they were coming from all directions. "You cannot escape." Claire stumbled backward, her mind racing. The hallway wasn't real anymore. The hotel was no longer just a building. It was something far darker, something that lived, and it would never let her go. Claire's chest tightened with fear, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the shadows crept closer, their tendrils swirling around her ankles, dragging at her, pulling her back toward room 428. The hallway felt like a maze, stretching infinitely in every direction, the walls closing in on her with each passing second. The hotel was no longer just a place. It was a living thing, its very presence wrapping around her, suffocating her, and it was hungry. The whispers, the voices, they were all around her. Low, guttural, filled with an ancient hunger that she couldn't escape. She could hear them now, clearer than before, overlapping in her mind, drowning out her thoughts, pulling her deeper into the darkness. "You can't run. You belong to us. You will never leave." The words were an endless chorus that echoed in her skull, the voices blending together like a twisted lullaby, soothing yet terrifying at the same time. She pressed her hands to her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her, winding through her veins, filling her every thought. She could feel them clawing at her, pushing her to go back to enter room 428 again. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. With trembling hands, Claire stumbled backward, her legs unsteady as the darkness crept closer, like it was alive. The hallway twisted in unnatural ways, the walls warping, stretching out of sight. the air growing colder. The temperature dropped so suddenly that Claire's breath fogged in front of her, and the cold seeped into her bones, making her shiver violently. The door to room 428 stood ahead, a silhouette in the distance, its edges glowing faintly in the dim light. It was calling her, beckoning her to come closer, but Claire could feel it now, the pull. It wasn't just the door, it was the room. It was alive, waiting for her. It had been waiting the whole time. Her heart pounded in her chest and her thoughts raced. She couldn't go back there. She couldn't face it again. But the darkness, it was suffocating. It was pulling at her, wrapping around her like a shroud, the shadows pushing her toward the door, toward the room. Every instinct in her told her to run, to keep moving, but her body refused to obey. The hotel had already claimed her once before, and it wasn't done with her yet. Claire's feet moved on their own accord, dragging her closer to the door, the whispers louder now, like 1,000 voices calling her name. She could feel the weight of them pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The figure, the one she had seen in the corner of the room, was there standing just behind the door, waiting for her. Its eyes glowing in the darkness. Its cold gaze pierced her, drawing her in. "You are ours." The voice was right behind her now, its breath cold against her skin, and Claire felt a chill spread through her deeper than the freezing air around her. She didn't want to turn around. She didn't want to face it. But the figure was there. It was always there, just behind her, watching. But before she could turn to confront it, she felt something tug at her wrist. A cold, clammy hand like ice gripped her arm. She didn't have to look to know what it was. She could feel its presence, the bone-chilling touch of something not human. Something that had no business being in the world of the living. The hand yanked her back, pulling her toward the door, forcing her closer to the darkness that awaited her beyond it. The whispers screamed in her mind, now the voices growing louder, faster, until they became a singular, deafening roar. "You cannot escape!" Claire's pulse raced as the hand dragged her forward, but she refused to give in. With every ounce of strength she had left, she fought back, pulling her arm free, her muscles burning with the effort. She took one final, desperate step back, her feet slipping against the floor as the shadows closed in around her. She was done running. With all her willpower, Claire slammed her hand against the doorframe. The moment her skin touched it, a shockwave of cold shot through her body, like 1,000 needles piercing her. But she didn't let go. She gritted her teeth against the pain, forcing herself to hold onto the doorframe as if it were the last thing in the world that could save her. The darkness, the shadows, they swirled around her, but they didn't touch her. For the first time since she'd entered the hotel, she felt the pressure begin to ease. The shadows, the presence, they were still there, lurking, watching, but they weren't reaching for her anymore. Claire gasped for air, her breath coming in uneven bursts, and she looked up, her gaze locked on the door to room 428. It was still there, but it no longer held the same power. The pull was still there, but it had weakened. The whispers were fading, the voices becoming softer like a distant echo, as if the room's grip on her was loosening. She took a step back then, another, her legs unsteady, but determined. The door to room 428 remained open, the shadows still curling around it, but Claire didn't care anymore. She had faced the room. She had faced the darkness, and she was walking away. For the first time she felt free, but as she stepped away, one last whisper filled her mind, as faint as a breath. "You will always return." Her heart stopped. She turned toward the door one last time. The shadows were still there waiting, but Claire kept walking. She was free, for now. Claire's feet carried her further down the hallway, each step echoing in the empty, suffocating silence. The room behind her, room 428, was growing distant, but the feeling of being watched didn't fade. She could still feel it, a pressure at the back of her neck, as if the hotel itself was following her, unwilling to let her slip away. Her heart pounded in her chest, every beat a reminder that she wasn't free. No matter how far she walked, no matter how much distance she put between herself and that cursed room, she could still feel it, like an invisible thread tied to her soul, tugging her back. The air around her felt thicker than it should have been, heavy with something she couldn't explain. The once familiar hallway now seemed endless, the walls stretching farther and farther away with every step. The low hum of electricity buzzed in her ears, mingling with the faint sound of her own breath, sharp and uneven. "You will always return." The whisper was faint, but it sliced through her thoughts like a blade. She stopped in her tracks, her chest tightening. She wasn't sure if she'd heard it outside her mind, or if it was coming from within her, but it didn't matter. It was there. For a brief, fleeting moment, Claire considered running, turning around, bolting back down the hallway, trying to escape the haunting pull that the hotel had on her. But she knew better. The figure, the shadows, they would catch her. They would always find her. No, not again. She couldn't let herself fall back into it. Not again. She had to stay strong. Her eyes darted to the door at the far end of the hallway, the only exit she could see. The door was cracked open, the faintest sliver of light spilling through the gap. It was an escape, she hoped, a way out. She couldn't stay here any longer. The hotel had already consumed too much of her life, and she wasn't about to let it take any more. Claire's feet moved, but it wasn't fast enough. The air around her shifted again, heavier this time, almost suffocating, like the walls were closing in. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, swirling around her until they were a cacophony of voices, their words indistinguishable, their presence a weight on her chest. The hotel was reaching for her once more, and this time it wasn't giving up. She tried to take another step, but the floor beneath her feet groaned, the sound like a scream from the very foundation of the building. She froze. It was too late. The shadows in the hallway began to shift, stretching and warping, creeping toward her from the corners of the room, like fingers reaching for their prey. Claire turned around, her eyes wide with terror, but the hallway had changed. The walls were no longer straight. They had begun to curve, bending inward, closing in on her. The room itself seemed to be alive, twisting and warping, as though it were some monstrous entity trying to swallow her whole. A figure moved from the corner just out of the light, and Claire's breath caught in her throat. It was the same figure, the one she had seen in room 428. It stepped forward, its form flickering in and out of sight, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was toying with her. She stepped back, her body frozen with fear, but the figure kept coming, the shadows growing darker, stretching toward her, pulling at her, suffocating her with their weight. The figure's eyes gleamed with an unnatural cold light, and its smile, its grin was too wide, too twisted. Claire could feel its presence closing in on her, the temperature in the hallway dropping as the shadows wrapped around her legs, pulling her toward the thing she had tried so desperately to escape. "You will never leave." The voice was deep now, reverberating in her skull like a heartbeat. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a command. Claire's chest tightened, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. But she didn't. She couldn't. The figure reached for her, its long, gnarled fingers stretching out. But Claire didn't wait. She turned on her heel and ran, her legs barely moving fast enough to escape the pull of the darkness that seemed to close in behind her. The door at the end of the hallway was still there, but it was no longer a safe haven. It was just another part of the nightmare. "You belong to us." The words wrapped around her like chains, dragging her back toward the figure pulling her down the hallway, the darkness threatening to swallow her whole. But Claire didn't stop. She refused to stop. Her legs screamed in protest, but she pushed through the pain, her eyes fixed on the door ahead. The closer she got, the louder the whispers became. The figure was still behind her, and the darkness pressed against her from all sides, but Claire was almost there. She could see the light from the hallway through the crack in the door, a sliver of hope in the growing shadows. She reached for the handle with trembling hands, her fingers brushing against it, and then everything went black. Claire gasped as the darkness swallowed her whole. Her hand had barely touched the door handle before the light vanished, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating blackness. Her heart hammered in her chest, her breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. She stumbled back, her hands pressed to her ears, trying to block out the voices, the whispers, the relentless presence that had followed her. "You cannot escape." The voice echoed in her mind, a deep, reverberating sound that made her bones tremble. The words were no longer just whispers. They were commands. They were real. They were coming from within the very walls of the hotel, the shadows, the space around her. Her eyes strained to see anything in the complete blackness. She couldn't even see her hands in front of her face. The room was pressing in on her, the weight of the darkness suffocating her, and every instinct in her told her to run, to move, to get away. But she couldn't. She was trapped. Her mind raced and her body trembled with the realization that there was no escape from this place. The hotel room 428 was alive, and it wasn't just a building. It was a force, a presence that had been waiting for her. She was its prisoner, caught in its grip, and no matter how far she ran, it would always find her. Claire opened her mouth to scream, but the sound died in her throat. She couldn't hear anything. No air, no sound, just the suffocating silence and the oppressive pull of the darkness around her. The weight of the whispers grew heavier, pressing on her chest, her mind, as if they were slowly cracking open her thoughts. "You are ours." The voice was closer now, so close that it felt like it was in her mind, breathing her thoughts for her. Claire wanted to collapse. Her knees buckled beneath her, but she refused to fall. She couldn't let herself give in. She would not let herself become one of them. She forced her legs to move slowly, painfully. She reached out, feeling her way through the suffocating dark, but it was as if the room itself was resisting her, pushing back against her every movement. She couldn't see anything. No walls, no floor, no door. Only the sense that she was being watched, stalked by something just beyond the edge of her perception. But she could feel it. The presence. The weight of it, like an invisible hand resting on her chest, pulling her downward, keeping her trapped. Every inch of space around her was heavy with the promise of doom. It was waiting. It was watching. The whispers turned into a low hum, a dull vibration that seemed to come from the very air itself. Claire's breath quickened as she fought to move forward, as though the air was thickening with each step. The shadows pulled at her legs, wrapping around her, whispering in her ear, urging her to turn around to face them. "Come back." She took another step, her foot slipping slightly against the slick, wet floor. The cold air was like ice against her skin, creeping into her bones, chilling her to the marrow. She couldn't see anything, nothing, but she felt it. Something was there, something in the darkness. The figure, the one that had stood at the foot of her bed, the one that had watched her. It was waiting for her to turn, waiting for her to give in. "You cannot escape." The voice was everywhere, now a constant ringing in her ears, a hum that vibrated in her chest. Claire's legs burned with the effort of moving through the suffocating dark, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The door was somewhere in front of her. She knew it was. She could feel its presence just beyond the pitch-black void. She reached out again, her fingers grazing the cold metal of the doorframe, and for the first time she felt a flicker of hope. She was so close. She could feel it. But the darkness pulled her back, the whispers in her mind growing louder, more frantic. You belong here. Claire's hand closed around the door handle. It was cold. It burned like ice in her grasp, and the very moment she touched it, she felt a sharp, agonizing pulse shoot through her arm. It was as if the hotel had just sent a shock wave through her body, as though it were trying to stop her from leaving. The pain was so intense, it almost made her drop the handle. But she didn't. She turned it. She twisted the handle, hearing the soft, agonizing click of the lock giving way, and then the door creaked open. The moment it did, a rush of cold air hit her face, but the hallway on the other side was no better. It was just as dark, just as suffocating. But beyond that, there was something else. A figure. It was standing in the middle of the hallway, just outside the doorway. Its long, skeletal form was barely visible, but Claire could feel it. She could feel its eyes on her. It was watching her. The figure stood motionless, its arms hanging at its sides, its mouth stretched into a thin, cruel grin. Her heart skipped a beat, but Claire didn't hesitate. She forced herself through the door, her body pushing forward, her feet stumbling as she entered the hallway. The air felt like it was closing in on her, but the figure remained where it was, blocking the way, its cold eyes following her every movement. The whispers started again, filling her head, swirling around her thoughts. You belong to us. She ran. She had to. Her feet pounded against the floor, the darkness pressing in from every side. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to outrun the pull of the shadows. Her legs burned, her body aching, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The hallway stretched on endlessly, the walls distorting and bending as though the building itself was trying to swallow her whole. And then she reached the end. There at the far end of the hallway was another door. She didn't know where it led, but it didn't matter. She couldn't stop. The figure was still there, just behind her, its presence filling the hallway, suffocating her. You cannot leave. With one last burst of energy, Claire reached for the door. She twisted the handle and threw it open, stepping into what she prayed would be the escape. But when the door closed behind her, everything was silent. The whispers faded. The darkness receded. For now, Claire's chest heaved with exertion, each breath ragged and shallow as she stood frozen in the new room. The door had closed behind her, cutting off the hallway, cutting off the shadows. For a moment, there was silence. The air was thick, almost tangible, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, it didn't feel suffocating. It felt still. She stood in the center of a small, dimly lit room. The walls were painted a dull shade of gray, peeling in spots, and there was a worn wooden chair in the center of the room, its legs uneven, scratched and chipped from years of neglect. The only light came from a single flickering bulb overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the walls. The floor beneath her feet creaked with every slight movement, as if it were alive, watching her too. Her pulse was still racing, but the intensity of the pull had lessened. The whispers were distant, now fading as though they had been left behind in the hallway. She wasn't sure what this room was, where it had come from, or if it had always existed. It was different from the rest of the hotel, less oppressive, less suffocating. But it felt wrong in its own way. It felt like the calm before the storm. Is this escape? Claire didn't know. She had to move. She couldn't just stand there, trapped in uncertainty. She needed to find a way out. She needed to survive. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything that could give her a clue, a sense of direction. But there was nothing. The walls were bare, save for a large, ornate mirror hanging on the far wall. It was framed in tarnished gold, the glass slightly fogged with age, reflecting the dim light in fragmented shards. But there was something strange about it, something off. The reflection didn't look quite right. Claire took a step toward it, her breath catching in her throat. As she drew closer, she saw that her reflection didn't move with her. It lingered a split second behind, like it was trapped in some other reality, unable to keep up with her. She reached out a trembling hand to touch the glass. The moment her fingers made contact, the coldness of the mirror hit her like an electric shock, and a jolt of something icy ran through her veins. She jerked back, heart pounding. The reflection in the mirror twisted. Her eyes widened. The reflection didn't mirror her movements anymore. It was different, distorted. Her reflection stood still, but it was now a twisted version of her. It was smiling, but not the way she smiled. It was an unsettling grin, one that spread too wide across its face, eyes glinting with something far darker than the person she had once been. No, her heart skipped a beat. She stepped back the room, spinning around her as she stumbled away from the mirror. But her reflection didn't follow. Instead, it stayed its smile, widening until its features began to contort, shifting into something inhuman. The figure in the mirror, it wasn't her. Not anymore. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she stumbled backward, the edges of her vision darkening her body, shaking with a cold fear that paralyzed her. The voice, the whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't in her head. It was coming from the mirror, from the twisted version of herself, its voice thick with malice. "You're not free, Claire. You can never escape." The words felt like a heavy weight pressing on her chest, suffocating her. Claire gasped, her hand clutching at her throat, her vision fading as the room seemed to close in around her. She stumbled back, her mind reeling with terror. The mirror. It was a reflection of the hotel of everything she had been running from. It wasn't just the room. It was everything. It was her. Her reflection reached out a hand from the other side of the glass, its fingers stretching toward her, twisting in ways that weren't human. "You belong to us, forever." The mirror cracked. At first, it was a small fracture. A single line that appeared across the glass, but then it spread, splitting the reflection down the center like a spider's web. The image in the mirror warped and shattered, but the figure's grin didn't falter. The glass continued to splinter, the cracks growing larger until finally it shattered completely. The sound of the glass breaking echoed in her ears louder than she could handle. The shards fell to the floor with 1,000 sharp clinks, the room now bathed in the dim glow from the overhead light. The reflection was gone, replaced by the shards scattered across the floor, the remnants of the mirror lying in pieces at her feet. Claire stood motionless, her body trembling with shock and disbelief. She could feel the air change, the pressure in the room thickening again. The whispers were louder now, filling the space, crawling inside her head like insects burrowing into her brain. "You will never escape." She spun around, her eyes darting around the room, but there was nowhere to run. The door was still there, but she knew that it didn't matter. She wasn't escaping the hotel. It was already inside her. It was in the very walls, in the mirror, in her. Her chest tightened. She wanted to scream, but her voice felt trapped, lost in her throat. She turned toward the only other thing in the room that remained untouched, the chair. But as her gaze landed on it, she froze. Sitting in the chair facing her was the figure, not the reflection, not a twisted image, but the real thing. Its skeletal hands rested on its lap. Its body was too thin, too stretched, its face a mask of shadows. The dark eyes gleamed at her, not cold, not indifferent, but hungry. It tilted its head slightly, as if examining her. "You belong to us, Claire," it said, its voice rasping like dry leaves scratching against stone. "You will always belong." Claire's breath caught in her throat, her heart slamming against her ribs. The chair was empty when she first entered the room. The figure hadn't been there, but now it was, and it was waiting for her to accept the inevitable. "You cannot escape." Claire's body went numb as the figure stood, its movements slow, deliberate, unnatural. It took a step forward, its skeletal limbs creaking with each movement. The shadows seemed to follow it, clinging to its form, wrapping around it like a shroud. "You will never be free." Claire's mind screamed, her body frozen. But the figure kept coming, its face now inches from hers, its cold breath filling her lungs. And in that moment, as its cold fingers reached for her, Claire realized something. There was no escape. The hotel had already claimed her. It was part of her. She would always be its prisoner. The darkness closed in, and the last thing she felt was its cold touch. The darkness swallowed Claire whole, the shadows pressing in from every direction, suffocating her. For a moment, she could feel nothing but the cold, the deep, icy chill that seemed to invade her every pore. It felt like she was falling, tumbling through an endless void, her body weightless, her thoughts scattered and broken. But the fall didn't stop. It felt like the room the hotel was tearing her apart, dragging her deeper into its grasp. "You belong to us." The voice was everywhere, now reverberating inside her mind, filling her every thought. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a force, an undeniable presence, wrapping around her, chaining her to the darkness. Her chest tightened with each breath, the weight of it pressing down on her, as if the very air was thickening, becoming heavier with every passing second. Her body was no longer her own. The hotel had claimed her. "You cannot leave." The whisper echoed louder in her skull, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block it out to make it stop. But it only grew louder until it felt like it was shaking her very soul, rattling her from the inside out. Her heart slammed against her chest, and she gasped for air, feeling the cold tightening around her lungs. Her vision blurred, the edges of the room fading until everything was swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness. But then suddenly, a light broke through, a soft, flickering glow that began to pulse in the distance. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The light. With every ounce of strength she could summon, Claire pushed against the cold that held her, the shadows that clawed at her, dragging her toward the light. It was the only thing that mattered now, the only thing that could save her. She reached for it, her fingers trembling, desperate. The light grew brighter with each step, pushing the shadows back. She could hear a faint sound, a whisper of movement in the air, like a breeze stirring the leaves. But the whispers didn't stop. They were still there, just behind her, still pressing in on her mind, urging her to stop, to give in. "You cannot escape." But Claire didn't stop. She couldn't. She pushed through the thick darkness, her body shuddering with each step. The light was closer now. She could see it clearly, a doorway just ahead, glowing faintly. Her fingers reached for the doorframe, and as soon as her hand touched it, the darkness around her began to recede like a fog, lifting in the morning light. The door creaked open, and Claire stepped through. The world was different now. The air was warmer, the light softer. She was no longer surrounded by the oppressive weight of the hotel, but she didn't feel safe. The whispers had faded, but their presence lingered, hovering just beyond her reach. Like a shadow she couldn't outrun. She turned around, looking back at the room, at the doorway she had just crossed through, but it was gone. There was no hallway, no walls, only the open air, the endless sky above her. Claire blinked her eyes, adjusting to the strange new world she had entered. It wasn't the hotel. It wasn't the darkness. It was something else. Something foreign. The ground beneath her feet felt solid, yet strangely unstable. It shifted with every step she took, as if the very earth were alive, moving beneath her. The air smelled fresh, but with a faint metallic tang, like the air before a storm. And then the first sound, soft, almost imperceptible, like the hum of distant machinery. Her eyes darted around, but there was nothing, only the horizon stretching endlessly in front of her. She was alone, or so she thought. Claire's heart skipped a beat. A shadow crossed her path, just a flicker at first, but unmistakable. Her breath caught in her throat, as the figure appeared before her. It was tall, a silhouette against the strange landscape, and though she couldn't make out its features, she knew it was there. The figure didn't move at first, just standing watching her, but its presence was enough to freeze her in place. The fear was back crawling up her spine, wrapping around her chest. "You cannot escape." The words weren't spoken aloud, but they flooded her mind, cold and final. She took a step back, then another, but the figure didn't follow. It didn't need to. Its presence was enough to paralyze her, to keep her locked in place, as though it were a part of the very landscape. But Claire wasn't finished. She wouldn't stop. Not here, not now. Her legs shaking her body on the edge of collapse, Claire turned her back to the figure and moved forward. She knew there was no running, no escape from this place, from the hotel. But she had to keep moving. The door, the light, the feeling of something. Someone waiting for her. It had to be more than this. Her hand reached out again, fingers trembling as she touched the warm air, feeling the thrum of electricity in the atmosphere. The hotel was still, with her still watching, but this time she didn't care. She stepped forward, the light at her back, now a memory fading into the distance. The shadows closed in, but Claire wasn't turning around. The journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, she knew she had a choice, and she was not going to let the hotel win. The world around Claire blurred. The warm light from before began to fade, and the shadows that had once seemed so distant were closing in around her again. She could feel them, the whispers. They were never truly gone. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, they were always there, just beneath the surface of her thoughts, waiting for the right moment to surface again. The wind shifted, a cold breeze cutting through the air, chilling her skin. The strange landscape she had entered felt familiar, and yet it was completely foreign. The sky, dark and endless, stretched above her like a void, and the ground beneath her feet shifted like it wasn't solid, like it was alive, bending with every step. She wasn't sure what had happened. Was it real? Was she still trapped in the hotel? Or had she somehow escaped it? Her mind was reeling with the possibilities, each thought tumbling over the other, trying to make sense of the twisted reality she was now in. "You cannot escape." The voice was soft at first, barely a whisper, but it grew louder with each step she took. Claire stopped in her tracks, her eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The figure, the one from the hotel, was nowhere to be seen, but she could still feel it, like a presence lingering just out of sight, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't the same as before, it was different now. Taller, darker, its form flickering like smoke, its eyes glowing faintly in the distance. Claire could feel the pull, the weight of its gaze pressing against her. It was drawing her in like the hotel had done before. It was calling her. She couldn't breathe. Her legs felt heavy, as though the ground was pulling her down, suffocating her with its weight. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. It was already there in her mind, in her soul, waiting for her to turn around, waiting for her to face it. Claire felt the heat rising in her chest, the tightness in her throat. She was no longer sure where the shadows ended and where the light began. The room, no, the place was alive. "You belong to us." The voice was clearer now, closer. Claire's pulse quickened as she stumbled backward, her feet sliding against the shifting ground. She wasn't sure if she could fight anymore. She wasn't sure if there was anything left of her that wasn't already claimed by the darkness. But then she heard something else, a sound faint but distinct, a whisper coming from behind her. "Don't look back." The voice was soft, familiar. It wasn't the figure. It wasn't the hotel. It was her own voice, the voice she had been trying to hold on to, the voice that had kept her moving, kept her fighting. It was a part of her, a reminder that she wasn't lost yet. "Don't look back, keep moving." Her heart skipped a beat, and Claire turned her body moving before she could stop herself. The figure was still behind her waiting, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had to keep moving, had to keep running. She would not let it claim her. "You cannot escape." The words cut through the air like a blade, but Claire kept running. The figure, the darkness, they were right behind her, but they weren't going to stop her. Not again. The ground shifted beneath her feet again, and she stumbled, her hands reaching out to catch herself. But as she fell, she didn't hit the ground. Instead, she felt herself pulled upward, as though the world around her was shifting, bending to the will of the hotel once more. The shadows grew longer, but the light was still there, flickering faintly at the edge of her vision. She could see it now, the door. It was real this time. The exit, the escape. It was there, just a few steps away. She couldn't stop now. She wouldn't. Claire reached for it, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold metal handle. The moment she touched it, a rush of warmth flooded through her. The whispers faded. The darkness receded. She pulled the door open, stepping into the light beyond, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The whispers were gone. The shadows had retreated. The hotel was behind her, locked away in the past. Claire stood in the doorway, the light now warm and welcoming, not cold and suffocating. The darkness had no hold on her. Not anymore. She was free. For now. But deep in the back of her mind, a familiar voice whispered again, "You will always return." Claire stood in the doorway, her breath heavy, her chest rising and falling with each strained inhale. The light that poured through the open door felt like the first real breath of air she had taken in what felt like ages. It was warm, comforting, as if the universe itself was reaching out to pull her away from the cold, suffocating grip of room 428. The darkness behind her receded, just a faint shadow now, but she could still feel it lurking just beyond the edges of her vision. Her mind was racing the whispers, still echoing faintly in the back of her thoughts. "You will always return." She couldn't shake the words, even though they were quiet now, just a ghost of a memory. She stepped over the threshold into the light, and the air seemed to clear. The oppressive weight that had pressed down on her chest began to lift, as if she were stepping out of the nightmare and into something real. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could hear the sound of her own breath, her heart slowing as the world around her returned to something resembling normal. But as she took her first steps away from the door, the air grew thick again, the shadows creeping along the edges of her vision. She felt the temperature drop, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. Her feet slowed, hesitant, as she glanced back toward the door she had just walked through. No, it's over. It has to be. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the room was still there, just beyond the edge of her sight, waiting for her to look back. The hotel. Room 428. It was a part of her now, a shadow that would never fully leave. Her breath caught as she turned her eyes, scanning the space around her. The hallway was long, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, the floor covered in stained carpet that was worn down in places as if time had taken its toll. But it didn't feel right. Nothing felt right. She could hear her own footsteps echoing in the silence. But it wasn't just the silence of a long abandoned building. It was the silence of something waiting, watching. It's not real. It's not here. Her mind fought against the panic rising in her chest. She couldn't allow herself to be consumed by it. She had to keep moving. She had to leave. But the further she walked, the heavier the air became. The walls seemed to stretch out before her, the hallway lengthening, growing darker with each step she took. The floor creaked beneath her feet, the sound eerily amplified in the stillness. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind blew down the hall, rattling the light fixtures above her. The temperature dropped sharply, and Claire shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her. Her breath came out in visible puffs, the chill sinking deep into her bones. No, she turned around again, eyes wide. The hallway was empty. The door to room 428 stood at the far end, just visible in the distance. It was there. She hadn't imagined it. It had never left her. A low hum filled the space, vibrating through her body. It was a familiar sound, the hum of electricity, the hum of the hotel itself. She could feel it in her bones, in the air. The presence that had followed her, that had always been there, was closing in again. She backed away, her mind racing, but her feet wouldn't move fast enough. She couldn't get away. It was here, it was always here, pulling her back toward it. The whispering voices began to fill the space once again. You belong here. The shadows crept forward, as if the very walls were reaching for her. Claire's feet moved faster, but the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the door never getting closer. You will never escape. Her body trembled with the weight of the words, the heavy pressure that seemed to fill her lungs, squeezing the air from her chest. She felt dizzy, like she was being pulled in two directions toward the door and away from it. The shadows were closing in again, moving faster until they were just inches from her, and then the door opened. Not slowly, not gently, but with an explosive force that made her stumble backward. The door swung open wide, revealing the room 428, waiting for her. She could hear it, feel it. It was inside the room, reaching out to her, drawing her back toward it. The figure, the shadows. It was there, waiting, patient. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. You can't leave. You can't run. Claire closed her eyes tightly, her heart racing. She could feel the presence in the room. It was drawing her in, pulling her toward it, with an invisible force. But she didn't want to go back. She couldn't. No. She turned away from the door, her legs moving on their own, carrying her down the hallway, further away from the room, further away from the darkness that had followed her. The hallway seemed to twist the walls, bending in strange, unnatural ways, as if the hotel itself were shifting, morphing to trap her, to pull her back inside. But Claire wasn't stopping. She couldn't stop. The further she moved, the closer the door seemed to get. She could feel the hotel's presence behind her, like a shadow stalking her every step. It was there, waiting for her to falter, to give in. But Claire didn't stop. She kept walking, her body exhausted, but her mind screaming, urging her to keep moving. She would not give in to the darkness. Not this time. She would not belong to it. Claire's feet felt as if they were moving through molasses, each step heavier than the last, the weight of her fear dragging her down the hallway. The hotel, the room, was still behind her, but she wasn't going back. She couldn't. The pull was real. Yes, and she could feel the tendrils of its darkness creeping back into her thoughts. But this time, she refused to let it take her. She didn't know how long she had been walking, but the hallway stretched on, seemingly endless, twisting in on itself, as if the building had no true shape. The walls, once old and crumbling, now seemed to pulse with a strange energy, their peeling wallpaper faintly shimmering in the dim light. The very air around her seemed to move thick and oppressive, like it was alive, like it was waiting for her to stop, to turn back, to give in. But Claire refused to stop. Her heart hammered in her chest as the whispers in the air began again. They were faint at first, like distant echoes, but they grew louder, sharper, until they were filling her mind again. You cannot leave. You belong to us. Her breath hitched. She could feel the pressure building inside her chest, a weight that was growing heavier with each passing moment. The whispers were familiar now. The voices of the shadows that had followed her, taunted her, trapped her in that cursed room. The hotel was always there, always just behind her, its presence a constant pressure against her. You cannot escape. She quickened her pace, trying to push through the fog of fear that clouded her thoughts, trying to shake off the overwhelming sense of inevitability that hung in the air like a storm about to break. The hallway felt endless, its walls closing in tighter with every step she took. She didn't know if she was still in the hotel or if it had somehow transformed into something else, a labyrinth, a living nightmare. It didn't matter. All that mattered was that she couldn't stop moving. Her mind raced with thoughts of escape, of freedom, of survival. But each time she tried to focus, the whispers would rise up again, louder, more insistent. You belong to us. We will always find you. She shook her head, trying to block them out, but it was no use. The hotel had woven itself too deeply into her. It was her now. The line between herself and the darkness had blurred, and the more she ran, the more it pulled at her. But as her mind twisted and contorted under the weight of the darkness, something inside her snapped. She was not going back. She refused to. Claire turned a corner, and the hallway stretched out before her, a long, narrow passage lit only by flickering lights. There was a door at the end. This door was different. It wasn't the one to room 428, but it felt familiar. Her steps faltered for a moment. She couldn't explain why, but she knew this door was important. The sense of knowing washed over her like a floodgate had opened inside her mind. She approached it slowly, her body screaming at her to turn away, but her feet betrayed her, bringing her closer and closer to the door. Her heart thundered in her chest, every beat urging her to stop, but she pushed through it. She reached the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. For a moment she hesitated. The whispers grew louder, 1,000 voices all screaming at her to turn back, to leave it alone. But she didn't. With a deep breath, Claire turned the handle. The door creaked open, and a rush of cold air hit her face. She stepped through her eyes, scanning the room as her heart beat faster, with the realization that she was no longer in the hotel. She was somewhere else. The room before her was nothing like the dim, suffocating halls of the hotel. It was bright, almost blinding, and she could see clearly now. The air smelled fresh like rain and earth, and the room itself felt alive. But as she looked around, she realized it wasn't just the room that was different. It was the landscape outside. Through the large windows that lined one wall, she could see trees swaying gently in the breeze, their leaves rustling softly. The sky was painted in the soft colors of sunset, casting everything in a warm, golden glow. Claire blinked, confusion clouding her thoughts. This didn't feel real. It couldn't be real, but it was. This was not the hotel. This was something else. The floor beneath her feet was solid, warm, and familiar. She looked down at the wooden boards, their surface worn smooth by time. Her mind spun with the realization that she had stepped into a place that was both foreign and yet strangely familiar. The air was lighter here, the atmosphere calm, but the heaviness she had carried with her was still there, lingering like a shadow in her chest. But as she stepped further into the room, something caught her eye. A figure stood by the window, its back to her, staring out at the landscape. Claire's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any figure, it was her. Her reflection. The realization hit Claire like a wave, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't her exact reflection, though. The woman standing at the window had the same posture, the same build, but there was something different about her. A sense of peace. Something that Claire herself had lost the moment she stepped into room 428. She stepped closer, the woman's form growing clearer with every step, and as she did, the figure turned. It smiled at her, the same gentle, familiar smile Claire had once known. "You're not lost anymore." Claire stopped in her tracks, her body frozen, her heart thundering in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The woman just stood there smiling, You've made it. You've found your way home. Claire's eyes widened in disbelief as she looked into the eyes of the woman, her own eyes reflecting back at her with a warmth that she hadn't felt in so long. But the room around her shifted, and the warmth quickly turned cold. You can't leave, the voice whispered again, this time from behind her. You can't escape. Claire turned. The door she had just entered from was now closed, but it was no longer the same door. It was shifting, warping, just like the shadows from the hotel, as though the very walls were closing in on her once again. The warmth of the room had already begun to slip away. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as the room began to shift again, the familiar warmth slipping away like sand through her fingers. The woman, her reflection, stood motionless, her smile never faltering. But something was wrong. Something had changed in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more pronounced, as though they were stretching out toward Claire, pulling her back into their suffocating embrace. The cold had returned. Claire took a step back, her mind reeling. The door had been there just moments ago, her escape, but now it was gone. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the whispers had started again, quiet at first, but growing louder, more insistent. You cannot leave. You belong to us. The voice was no longer just in her head. It was all around her, filling the room, wrapping around her like a thick fog. The room had become distorted, the edges of the walls bending, as if the very space was alive, warping with every breath she took. The ground beneath her feet was unsteady, shifting like it was made of liquid, and her legs trembled as she tried to move. You cannot escape. Claire's breath hitched. She turned toward the window, desperate to find something, anything to ground her in this surreal nightmare. But the view outside was different now. The trees, once calm and peaceful, were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The golden light from the setting sun had faded, replaced by a sickly green hue that bathed the landscape in an unnatural glow. She reached out her fingers, brushing against the cold glass of the window, but when she looked down, she realized with horror that the world outside had become a reflection, just like the mirror in room 428. The truth hit her like a tidal wave. She was trapped again. You're not free. The voice was right behind her now, a cold breath on her neck, and Claire spun around, her body stiff with fear. The woman, the reflection, was standing in the center of the room, its smile now a twisted, malicious grin. Her eyes were hollow, empty, like two dark pits staring into Claire's soul. You will never leave. Claire staggered backward, her body shaking with terror as the reflection took a step forward. The room around her seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and the darkness was creeping closer, enveloping her with every step she took. The air was thick with the presence of something otherworldly, something ancient that had been watching her since the moment she had entered the hotel. She could feel it in the very air. It was not just a building. The hotel was alive. It was a part of her now. It had marked her, claimed her, and no matter where she ran, no matter how far she went, it would always pull her back. Her mind screamed, but the words wouldn't come. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place as the reflection drew nearer. She wanted to run, to escape, but the shadows were too strong. The figure, her own figure, was right in front of her now, its cold hand reaching out toward her. You cannot leave, it repeated, its voice now a low, guttural growl. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the coldness of its fingers as they brushed against her skin. She recoiled, but the figure wouldn't let go. Its grip tightened, and Claire could feel herself being pulled toward it, drawn into its darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind, until they became a deafening roar. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It was as if the room itself had come alive, pulling her into the shadows that loomed at the edges of her vision. The reflection was no longer just her. It was something else, something twisted, something ancient, and it had claimed her. You belong to us. The words were final, like a death sentence. The darkness consumed her vision, and as she closed her eyes in surrender, she realized something. The hotel had never let her go. It had always been inside her, waiting for her to return. The figure grinned, its hollow eyes shining with an unearthly light as it pulled her into the void. Claire's mind screamed, but it was no use. There was nowhere left to run. The hotel had claimed her, and she was its. Her body grew heavy, her limbs numb as she sank into the darkness, the last remnants of her consciousness slipping away. And then everything went black. Claire's heart pounded in her chest as the room began to shift again, the familiar warmth slipping away like sand through her fingers. The woman, her reflection, stood motionless, her smile never faltering, but something was wrong. Something had changed in the air. The shadows in the corners of the room grew darker, more pronounced, as though they were stretching out toward Claire, pulling her back into their suffocating embrace. The cold had returned. Claire took a step back, her mind reeling. The door had been there just moments ago, her escape. But now it was gone. The walls seemed to close in on her, and the whispers had started again, quiet at first, but growing louder, more insistent. You cannot leave. You belong to us. The voice was no longer just in her head. It was all around her, filling the room, wrapping around her like a thick fog. The room had become distorted, the edges of the walls bending as if the very space was alive, warping with every breath she took. The ground beneath her feet was unsteady, shifting like it was made of liquid, and her legs trembled as she tried to move. You cannot escape. Claire's breath hitched. She turned toward the window, desperate to find something, anything, to ground her in this surreal nightmare. But the view outside was different now. The trees, once calm and peaceful, were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands clawing at the sky. The golden light from the setting sun had faded, replaced by a sickly green hue that bathed the landscape in an unnatural glow. She reached out her fingers, brushing against the cold glass of the window, but when she looked down, she realized with horror that the world outside had become a reflection just like the mirror in room 428. The truth hit her like a tidal wave. She was trapped again. You're not free. The voice was right behind her now, a cold breath on her neck, and Claire spun around, her body stiff with fear. The woman, the reflection, was standing in the center of the room, its smile now a twisted, malicious grin. Her eyes were hollow, empty, like two dark pits staring into Claire's soul. You will never leave. Claire staggered backward, her body shaking with terror as the reflection took a step forward. The room around her seemed to shrink, the walls closing in, and the darkness was creeping closer, enveloping her with every step she took. The air was thick with the presence of something otherworldly, something ancient that had been watching her since the moment she had entered the hotel. She could feel it in the very air. It was not just a building. The hotel was alive. It was a part of her now. It had marked her, claimed her, and no matter where she ran, no matter how far she went, it would always pull her back. Her mind screamed, but the words wouldn't come. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen in place as the reflection drew nearer. She wanted to run to escape, but the shadows were too strong. The figure, her own figure, was right in front of her now, its cold hand reaching out toward her. You cannot leave, it repeated, its voice now a low, guttural growl. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the coldness of its fingers as they brushed against her skin. She recoiled, but the figure wouldn't let go. Its grip tightened, and Claire could feel herself being pulled toward it, drawn into its darkness. The whispers grew louder, filling her mind until they became a deafening roar. She couldn't think, couldn't breathe. It was as if the room itself had come alive, pulling her into the shadows that loomed at the edges of her vision. The reflection was no longer just her. It was something else, something twisted, something ancient, and it had claimed her. "You belong to us." The words were final, like a death sentence. The darkness consumed her vision, and as she closed her eyes in surrender, she realized something. The hotel had never let her go. It had always been inside her, waiting for her to return. The figure grinned, its hollow eyes shining with an unearthly light as it pulled her into the void. Claire's mind screamed, but it was no use. There was nowhere left to run. The hotel had claimed her, and she was its. Her body grew heavy, her limbs numb as she sank into the darkness, the last remnants of her consciousness slipping away. And then everything went black. Claire's eyes snapped open, her body jolting as if awakening from a nightmare. Yet nothing felt familiar anymore. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as though she had been submerged under water for far too long. Her head spun as she tried to sit up, but everything around her was blurry, her vision clouded by an unnatural haze. The air smelled thick and damp, like mildew and decay, the taste of it coating the inside of her mouth. She tried to push herself to her feet, but her legs trembled with weakness, her body shaking uncontrollably. The room was dark, dimly lit by a faint flickering light in the corner. Her surroundings felt wrong. The walls were uneven, like they had shifted, warped by time and weight. The floor beneath her was soft, like rotting wood beneath a thin layer of dust. The air hung heavy, thick with the presence of something old and forgotten, something that never fully let go. And that presence, it was here. Claire tried to stand, her hands bracing against the floor as she pushed herself up, but her arms trembled as though they were made of glass, fragile and cracking with every movement. She looked around, desperate to find something to hold on to, but the shadows in the room seemed to move, stretching and crawling toward her like living things. "You can't escape." The voice, cold and hollow, crawled into her mind. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was loud, booming in her ears, filling her skull with its relentless command. The room seemed to twist the walls, bending inward, like they were closing in on her, suffocating her. She gasped, her hands reaching out toward the walls, her fingers scraping against the crumbling surface. The shadows closed in suffocating, pushing her closer to the center of the room, where the dim light flickered weakly. "You belong to us." Claire couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Her chest felt as though it was being crushed by an unseen weight, her lungs unable to take in enough air. The darkness was pulling at her, wrapping around her, like chains, like tendrils of something ancient and hungry. It was the hotel, the presence coming back for her, dragging her deeper into the void. It was never going to let her go. "You belong to us, forever." Claire's heart thudded in her chest, each beat like a drum of dread. The whispers didn't stop. The voices, the shadows, they pressed in from every angle, suffocating her, drowning her in their relentless presence. The walls felt like they were alive, breathing with her, the air becoming thicker, colder. But then something shifted. A faint light appeared in the distance, barely visible at first, but growing brighter with each passing second. It was the smallest glimmer of hope, something beyond the endless darkness. The light was real. She could feel it, even if it seemed impossible. The presence in the room flared with anger. The shadows writhed, twisting, reaching out toward her with cold, skeletal fingers. But Claire didn't stop. She pushed herself toward the light, her legs shaky beneath her, her body protesting the effort. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The closer she got to the light, the heavier the darkness became. It felt like it was suffocating her, like it was pulling her down, dragging her into the void once more. But the light was getting brighter. It was there, just ahead of her. "You cannot escape." Claire's mind screamed in defiance. She could hear the voice, feel its presence, but she pushed forward, her arms outstretched, her body almost collapsing from the effort. With one last desperate surge of energy, Claire lunged toward the light, and then the darkness broke. She stumbled through the threshold, the world shifting around her as the heavy weight lifted from her chest. The light enveloped her, a warm, soothing glow that spread through her like the first breath of fresh air after drowning. She took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the air fill her lungs for the first time in what felt like forever. She was free, but as she stood there catching her breath, she could feel the familiar tug at the back of her mind. The whispers hadn't completely faded. They lingered in the corners of her thoughts, growing weaker, but still there like an echo in the distance. Claire stepped forward into the light, and the darkness slowly began to recede like a fog lifting from the land. The weight on her chest lifted the shadows retreating into the corners, leaving her standing in the glow of warmth. But she knew that no matter how far she ran, she would always carry a piece of the darkness with her. The hotel had changed her. It had marked her. The light grew brighter, wrapping around her in a soft, gentle embrace, and Claire stepped forward, leaving the dark room behind her. She would never fully escape the grip of the hotel, but for now the weight was lifted. For now she was free. The light around Claire grew brighter with each step she took, but there was still a nagging sense of unease in the pit of her stomach. As the last traces of darkness began to retreat, she realized that the weight she had carried for so long had not truly lifted. The light was soothing, yes, but it was also blinding, masking the truth she wasn't free. Not really. She paused for a moment, the warmth of the light washing over her, filling her with a temporary sense of relief. The whispers, the voices were quieter now, barely a hum at the edges of her consciousness, but they were still there. They hadn't abandoned her. "You will always return." The words came again, louder than before, as though the very air around her was breathing them into her thoughts. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. Her legs wobbled beneath her, and she leaned against the nearest wall for support. The room around her felt too still, too perfect. It was almost too peaceful. The door she had entered through was gone, replaced by a smooth white wall that seemed to stretch endlessly in either direction. No handles, no way out. Trapped again. A cold shiver ran down her spine as the realization hit. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, it would always find her. The hotel was inside her now, in her thoughts, in her memories, in the very essence of who she was. Her breath came faster, her chest tightening with the overwhelming weight of it. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. The room, the light was closing in on her. It felt like it was swallowing her whole, wrapping her in its grip until there was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. But then, just as the panic began to overwhelm her, she felt something, a flicker of energy deep inside her, a spark of defiance. The whispers, the voice, they weren't going to take her this time. Not without a fight. "You belong to us." Claire squeezed her eyes shut, shutting out the voice, shutting out the room, the light. She forced herself to take a slow, steadying breath. She had fought the darkness before. She could do it again. She had to do it again. The moment she opened her eyes, the room shifted. The white walls wavered like the edges of a mirage, bending and distorting, revealing the truth beneath them. The floor cracked, splitting open, revealing the familiar sight of room 428, the very room that had haunted her, the very room that had started it all, stood before her. She could see it now, the peeling wallpaper, the decaying floorboards, the bed in the center of the room tangled and unmade. The door was just behind her, a whisper of a shadow beckoning her forward. But this time, it wasn't the hotel calling. It wasn't the shadows pulling her in. This time, Claire was in control. This time, she had a choice. The whispers tried to claw at her again, but she pushed them aside. "You cannot escape. You belong to us," they echoed in her mind, but they no longer had power over her. She was done running. She was done being trapped. With steady hands, Claire stepped forward into the room. She didn't hesitate. The bed was still there, its presence just as suffocating as it had been before, but she didn't let it intimidate her. The room was no longer just a place. It was a memory, and memories, they couldn't hurt her anymore. The figure was there too, standing in the corner, watching her with those cold, lifeless eyes. But Claire didn't turn away. She didn't flinch. "You're not real." Her voice was steady, stronger than she felt. The figure didn't move. It didn't speak. "I'm not yours." Her words echoed in the room, and for the first time since entering the hotel, she felt a sense of power. It wasn't the hotel. It wasn't the figure. It was her. The shadows that had surrounded her began to wane, retreating, pulling away from the room, as though they had no hold on her anymore. The figure in the corner faded its outline, dissipating like smoke. Claire took another step forward, this time with purpose. The room was still there, but it was no longer a prison. She had broken free of it. The whispers grew fainter. "You cannot leave." But Claire didn't stop. She didn't turn back. She reached for the door. The handle was cold beneath her fingers, but she didn't hesitate. She turned it, and as she pushed the door open, a wave of cool air rushed in, the sweet scent of fresh air and freedom washing over her. The hallway outside was dim, but it was real. It was empty quiet. The oppressive weight of the hotel's presence had receded, leaving her standing in the space that belonged to her. She stepped through the doorway, and for the first time the light didn't flicker. It stayed steady, warm, a beacon of truth, and as the door closed behind her, Claire knew. She wasn't free from the shadows. Not yet, but she was free from the hotel. For now, and she would never stop fighting. Claire stood in the dim hallway, her heart still pounding in her chest. The door behind her had closed, but the weight of its presence lingered. The hotel, the shadows, the whispers, they were not gone. They had simply retreated for now, waiting. Always waiting. The hallway stretched before her, long and silent. The air was thick with the heaviness of what she had just escaped, but the quiet was almost too much to bear. Claire felt the isolation pressing in, like the walls of the hotel were trying to close in on her once more. She took a step forward, her feet unsteady beneath her, and then another. Each movement felt like a battle. She could still hear the echoes of the voice in her mind, the deep, guttural whispers that had filled the hotel, that had haunted her dreams and dragged her into its grip. "You cannot escape. You belong to us." The words haunted her thoughts, but this time they weren't as powerful. This time she knew better than to listen. The hotel might have claimed her once, but not again. Not anymore. The hallway seemed to go on forever, but Claire kept moving forward. The walls were lined with old paintings, faded and peeling, their once vibrant colors dulled by time. The light overhead flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor. It felt like a dream, one that Claire couldn't escape, no matter how fast she ran. "You will never escape." But this time Claire wasn't afraid. She wasn't running. She was walking with purpose. She had made it this far, and she wasn't going to stop now. As she continued down the hallway, she noticed something strange. A door, different from the others, stood at the far end. It wasn't as worn or decayed as the others. It wasn't the same as the ones she had passed. The handle was gleaming, almost beckoning her to approach. Claire's steps slowed as she reached the door. There was something about it, something familiar and new at the same time. It wasn't like the other doors, the ones that had led her to the heart of the hotel. This door didn't feel like it was trying to pull her back into the darkness. It felt like an escape, Her fingers brushed against the handle and a strange warmth spread through her. The cool metal didn't feel cold like it had before. It felt alive, as though the door itself were calling her forward, urging her to open it. Her heart raced, the whispers in her mind growing louder, but she blocked them out. She wasn't going back. She wasn't going to let the hotel claim her again. With a deep breath, Claire turned the handle and opened the door. The light beyond was brighter, softer, like the morning sun spilling over the horizon. As she stepped through the door, she was greeted by a rush of cool air, fresh and clean. The hallway behind her seemed to vanish as the door closed with a soft click, and Claire found herself standing in an open field. For the first time in what felt like forever, the ground beneath her feet was solid. The sky above her was wide and open, the clouds drifting lazily across a pale blue canvas. The scent of fresh grass filled the air, and for the first time in a long time, Claire could breathe without the weight of darkness pressing against her. She stood there for a moment, her feet planted firmly on the earth, feeling the sunlight on her skin. The hotel was gone. The whispers had faded into nothing, their echoes no longer filling her thoughts. But as Claire looked around, she realized something. The hotel wasn't just behind her. It had shaped her. Its darkness, its weight had been a part of her. It had been inside her, in her thoughts, in her memories. And now, as she stood in the open field, she felt it still just a faint echo lingering in the corners of her mind. "You will always return." The voice was soft, a whisper at the edges of her consciousness. But Claire wasn't afraid. She knew now that the darkness had no true power over her. It had tried to claim her, to pull her into its endless grip. But she had fought back, and she would keep fighting. Claire took another step forward, her feet moving on their own accord. She wasn't looking back. She wasn't turning around. The hotel room 428 was behind her. It was a part of her past, but it wouldn't define her. For the first time, she felt the weight lift from her chest, the suffocating grip of fear and darkness fading into the distance. The sun on her face was warm, the grass beneath her feet solid. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking forward, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Claire smiled. Claire's smile didn't last long. As she continued walking, the world around her seemed to shift again, like an illusion fading before her eyes. The soft, warm grass beneath her feet began to grow cold and brittle. The sun, once bright and welcoming, flickered and dimmed as though it were sinking into a clouded horizon. The faint echoes of whispers from the past began to rise again, crawling through her mind, becoming louder, more insistent. "You can never escape." The voice, once distant, was now right behind her, like a shadow that followed every movement, every thought. She spun around her heart, leaping in her chest, but there was nothing. No figure, no presence, just the empty, endless field. But still, the weight of the hotel hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as if it had never truly left. "You belong to us." Claire closed her eyes, her hands pressed against her temples. She could feel it just beneath the surface of her thoughts. The hotel, the room, the shadows, they were inside her, woven into her very being. But no, she wouldn't let it. She wouldn't let the darkness win. The whispers began to fade as Claire took a deep breath, pushing them away with the strength she had left. She had fought the hotel once, and she could do it again. She was stronger now, stronger than she had ever been. She had already escaped. Her eyes snapped open and the world around her shifted again. This time the light returned, and the field seemed to stretch before her in a wide-open expanse. The sun shone brightly, casting golden rays over the landscape. The shadows receded into nothing, their grasp on her mind slipping away like smoke. Claire's legs moved forward, her feet now sure and steady. She was walking, but this time it wasn't out of fear. She wasn't running from the hotel, from the figure, from the darkness. She was walking towards something real, something new. The whispers were gone now, their voices fading into the wind, and Claire smiled again. A real smile this time, one full of strength of release. She reached the edge of the field and stopped taking in the scene before her. It was a vast open plain stretching endlessly under a clear sky. The landscape was unfamiliar, but there was something comforting about it, like a new beginning. She could feel it in her bones. The hotel room 428. The shadows, they had tried to claim her, but they hadn't. She was free now. Free of the weight that had followed her, free of the chains that had held her for so long. She took another step, and the ground beneath her feet solidified the earth firm and real. The world around her seemed to breathe with her in sync, as if the very land recognized her presence. She had escaped the hotel. She had broken its hold. "You cannot escape." The whisper came again, but it was faint, almost drowned out by the sounds of the world around her. The wind, the soft rustling of the grass, the chirping of birds in the distance. The world felt alive, vibrant, real. The whisper grew quieter, and Claire didn't flinch. The shadows may have followed her, but they no longer had any power. They were a part of her past, something she had left behind. She walked forward, her heart light, her steps sure. The sun above her, the sky stretching endlessly, the horizon before her. It was a new world, a world free of the hotel, free of the darkness that had haunted her for so long. "You will always return." The voice was softer now, like a distant memory fading with time, no longer a threat. But Claire kept walking, her eyes focused on the horizon. The path ahead was clear. She didn't need to look back. The hotel was behind her. The darkness was fading. She had won. She had escaped. And for the first time in a long time, she was at peace. The world ahead was her own. As Claire continued her journey forward, the landscape shifted once more. At first, she thought she was imagining it. The world around her seemed to blur like the edges of a painting losing its detail. The ground beneath her feet became uneven again, the grass turning to a cracked, parched earth. The once vibrant sky darkened, a cloudless void of gray looming overhead. The air grew heavy once more, a deep chill settling over her, as if the warmth of the world was being drained away. The whispers, those familiar taunting whispers, began to return, crawling up from the depths of her mind, growing louder with each passing second. "You cannot escape." Claire stopped in her tracks, the ground beneath her feet sinking slightly, as if it were pulling her in. She closed her eyes tightly, taking a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves, but the air felt thicker, colder. The weight of the hotel, the darkness that had followed her, was returning with a vengeance, as though it had never left. "You belong to us." The voice was louder now, more insistent, like a cold wind that cut through her skin and down to her bones. Her pulse quickened, her breath shallow, as she fought against the rising panic that threatened to take hold. She had been free. She had escaped. Why was this happening again? Her body tensed as she felt the ground beneath her shift again. The earth seemed to move, the cracked earth beneath her feet, growing more unstable, the cracks widening, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She couldn't move. The hotel was pulling her back in its grip, tightening around her like chains. She opened her eyes, her breath coming in short, rapid gasps as she glanced around, desperate to understand what was happening. The world around her was now a twisted version of itself. The once serene landscape had become a barren wasteland. The trees, if they could even be called trees, were gnarled and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The ground was no longer solid beneath her feet, but soft, as if she were walking on quicksand. And there it was, the hotel looming ahead of her in the distance. It wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the hotel she had left behind. No, this one was darker, more oppressive. Its edges blurred like it was part of the very earth itself, The door to room 428 was visible just beyond the building, faintly glowing in the distance like a beacon of doom. Claire's breath caught in her throat as she turned toward the door. No. She had fought this. She had escaped. She couldn't let it pull her back in, but the whispers grew louder. The shadows around her began to move again, wrapping around her legs, pulling her toward the hotel, dragging her forward, despite her will to resist. You are ours. The voice was like a deep, resonating drumbeat inside her skull. Claire felt the pull at her chest again, a weight, a pressure that squeezed her heart, her lungs making it harder to breathe. She was falling backward, pulled toward the hotel like a puppet on strings, her body no longer her own. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the ground, the weight of the world crashing down on her. Her hands dug into the dirt beneath her as she tried to resist, as she tried to crawl away from it, but the shadows were relentless. They wrapped around her wrists, her ankles dragging her closer to the door, closer to the room that had haunted her dreams, that had stolen her from the world she had once known. Claire could feel it. The room was alive, the darkness in it, the weight of it pressing against her soul. It wasn't just the room. It was the hotel. It was inside her now, and no matter how far she ran, no matter how many times she fought, it would always find her. Always pull her back. You cannot escape. The voice was all around her now, a chorus of shadows, a chorus of everything that had ever hunted her in the dark. Claire gasped for air, her body trembling, her hands now bleeding from where the shadows had torn at her skin. The door was so close now. She could feel its pull like it was a part of her, like it was her. Room 428. The figure. The darkness. It had been waiting for her, and she had no choice but to face it again. She tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed her voice. Her breath came out in gasps as she finally reached the door. The air around her crackled with an unnatural energy, the shadows swirling violently, as though the very hotel was coming to life, feeding off her fear. She raised her hand to the door handle, and when her fingers made contact, an electric shock coursed through her body. Welcome home. The door creaked open, and Claire stepped through. Claire stepped into the room, but it wasn't what she expected. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and rot, the kind of stench that made her stomach turn. The walls of room 428 were not the decaying, peeling surfaces she remembered. They were smooth, unnaturally clean, but still dark, as if the very walls themselves had absorbed the horror of everything that had happened in this place. The room felt alive, pulsing with an energy that made her skin crawl. Her heartbeat was deafening in her ears as she stepped further into the room. The bed, unmade and twisted like a coil, sat in the center of the room, its sheets tangled in knots. The same faint flicker of light from before came from the single dim bulb hanging above, casting long, grotesque shadows that stretched and writhed like living things. As she walked, her feet dragging against the worn floorboards, Claire felt a chill, a coldness that seeped through her bones, making her shiver. It was the same feeling she had had before, when she first entered the hotel, the sensation of being watched, of being followed. And then she heard it, a sound soft but unmistakable, a quiet whisper almost drowned out by the oppressive silence around her, but it was there. You cannot leave. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She tried to turn around, but the door had already slammed shut behind her, the sound of it reverberating in the stillness like a warning. Her breath quickened as she realized she was trapped again. She spun around, eyes scanning the room in a frantic blur. The walls seemed to close in the shadows, growing longer, their fingers reaching toward her, trying to pull her back into the depths of the darkness. The figure was there, standing in the corner of the room, as if it had always been waiting for her. Its silhouette was barely visible, the dim light from above, casting just enough of a shadow to show its outline. But Claire could feel its presence looming, waiting. Her legs froze. She couldn't move. You will never escape." The voice came again, low and menacing, sending a chill up her spine. The figure stepped forward, its face emerging from the darkness, and Claire gasped. It wasn't just any figure. It wasn't even the shadowy form from before. It was her, but not her. The figure in front of her was twisted, its eyes hollow and black, its lips stretched into an unnatural grin. It was a reflection of herself, but it wasn't her. It was a mockery, a distorted version, something otherworldly. "You belong here." Claire's chest tightened. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled to take a step back. But no matter how hard she tried, her legs wouldn't move. The figure stepped forward again, its long skeletal hands outstretched, its grip closing in on her. This was it. This was the end. The hotel had finally claimed her. But something inside her snapped. The darkness. The figure. It wasn't real. It was a manifestation. It was a part of her mind. Part of the fear that had been growing inside her since she first stepped foot into this place. She had let it consume her. She had let it define her, but not anymore. No, her voice was weak at first, a whisper of defiance, but as she spoke, the shadows seemed to flicker, the figure's form beginning to fade. It was losing its hold on her. She had the power. She always had. Claire stepped forward, her legs shaking with the effort, but she kept moving, her feet dragging across the floor as she reached out her fingers, brushing against the cold, glassy surface of the mirror on the wall. The mirror. It was the one thing that had never stopped tormenting her. The reflection. The distorted version of herself. But now she knew. The reflection wasn't just something to be feared. It was a truth. It was a part of who she was. With shaking hands, Claire pulled the mirror from the wall, the cold glass heavy in her grasp. The moment she held it up, the figure in the corner began to melt away, its features, warping, twisting, and disappearing, just like smoke in the wind. The hotel trembled. "You cannot leave." The whisper was faint now, a fading echo, but it wasn't enough to stop her. Claire pressed the mirror against the wall, and for the first time since entering the hotel, she felt the weight of the darkness begin to lift the room, pulling back, the grip of the hotel slowly loosening. The air grew warmer. The shadows receded. The whispers died away, and with a deep breath, Claire stepped away from the mirror, her feet steady beneath her, her body no longer trembling. She was free, for now. The room around her shifted, the walls crumbling away as the door to the outside opened, revealing a bright light. She stepped forward, the threshold now clear, the weight of the hotel, the darkness finally gone. The journey wasn't over, but she had made it through the worst, and she wasn't going to stop. Claire stepped through the threshold of the open door, her heart racing but steadying with each passing second as she crossed into the bright light beyond. The oppressive atmosphere of room 428, the darkness, the whispers, they were fading, slipping into the distance like the remnants of a long, haunting dream. She could still feel them lingering at the edges of her mind, but the pull was weaker now. The door was behind her closed, the weight of the hotel's grip finally released. She stood in an open space, a vast, endless plain under a clear blue sky. The wind, soft and warm, brushed against her skin, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth, of new beginnings. The grass beneath her feet felt solid and real, a far cry from the decaying ground she had left behind in the hotel. There were no walls closing in on her, no shadows creeping toward her, no figure waiting to claim her. The light was steady and constant, bathing the landscape in a peaceful glow. It was as if the hotel had never existed. She breathed deeply, her lungs filling with fresh air, the weight on her chest lighter than it had been in years. She let her shoulders relax, her body unwinding from the tension that had gripped her for so long. For the first time in what felt like forever, Claire could simply breathe. But even as the calm settled in, the quiet seemed wrong, too still. There was a strange, unsettling calm in the air, as though the world was holding its breath. A part of her deep buried in her mind began to wonder if she was truly free. Had she escaped? Or was this just another part of the same nightmare? Her eyes scanned the horizon, the endless plain stretching out before her. There was no sign of anything familiar. No buildings, no roads, just the vast emptiness of the world. And yet a part of her felt the pull again, the same feeling she had experienced when she first entered room 428. The feeling of being watched. The breeze shifted, carrying a faint whisper through the air. "You will always return." The words were faint, but clear, echoing in the back of her mind. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She had heard those words before. They were the same words the hotel had whispered to her in room 428. The same voice, the same presence. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned, scanning the open field. But there was no one there. No figure, no shadow. Nothing but the vast emptiness around her. But she felt it, the weight of it. The feeling that she was never truly free. Her mind raced. She couldn't go back to that place. The hotel had already claimed so much of her. It had shaped her, twisted her thoughts, and there was no escaping that. No escaping what it had done to her. But what if the hotel wasn't gone? What if it was still here, lurking just beyond her sight, waiting for her to give in? Claire shook her head, her hand rising to press against her temple. She couldn't think like this. She had to believe she had escaped. She had to push past the fear. She took a step forward, the grass beneath her feet crunching softly. Another step. And then another. Each movement felt more certain, more grounded, as though the weight of the shadows behind her was finally slipping away. But as she walked, the feeling didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. She could still hear the whispering, the subtle pull, the darkness at the edges of her thoughts. It was there, always there. "You cannot escape." The words came again, louder this time, a low guttural growl that vibrated through her chest. Claire's breath hitched, and she froze. Behind her, the air seemed to shimmer. The world twisted, and the field began to warp like a reflection in water being disturbed. The horizon blurred. The sky darkened. No, Claire turned sharply, but the world around her didn't match what she had just seen. The field, no longer empty, was now filled with twisted skeletal trees, their branches clawing at the air like broken fingers. The sky was thick with clouds, the once bright light now fading into an ominous dusk. The wind shifted, carrying a chill that sank deep into her skin. She wasn't in the same place anymore. "You belong here." The voice was closer. Claire spun around, her heart racing. And there it was, the hotel standing in the distance, but not the version she had left behind. This one was darker, taller, like an enormous shadow looming over her. The same cold, oppressive presence from before, but now it felt stronger, more solid, as though it had never truly let her go. She could feel it now, the pull. The pull back into its depths, into its darkness. The whispers rose again, swirling around her mind, and Claire felt the air grow thicker, suffocating her. The room, the hotel, was never really gone. It had always been here waiting. Her knees buckled as the weight of it pressed down on her chest. The hotel was a part of her now, just like the shadows, just like the darkness. She could never escape it. "You will always return." And this time, as the whispers wrapped around her, Claire couldn't resist. The hotel was a part of her, and no matter how far she ran, it would always find her. She closed her eyes, the cold of the hotel creeping back into her skin. The whispers filled her ears, and she felt herself being pulled backward toward the door, toward room 428, toward the dark figure waiting just beyond. The pull was undeniable. The air itself seemed to tighten around Claire's chest as she felt the shadows tug at her, dragging her backward toward the door. The hotel was calling to her again, its presence thick and suffocating, wrapping around her like a cold shroud. She could hear the faint, echoing whispers growing louder, each word more insistent than the last. "You belong to us." The voice sent a chill down her spine, a deep resonance that shook her to the core. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a force that moved through her, compelling her to obey. She could feel it within her bones, like an invasive pulse. The hotel was never going to let her go. It was inside her now, ingrained in every part of her being. Claire's legs trembled beneath her, but she didn't stop moving. She couldn't. The door to room 428 loomed in front of her just ahead, its cold, ominous outline beckoning her to return to finish what had started. The door was the heart of it all, the portal that had begun her journey into the darkness. It was where she had lost herself, and it was where she would have to confront whatever it was that had followed her. Her feet moved forward, though every step felt like wading through thick, invisible water. She couldn't look back. She couldn't stop now. She reached the door and touched the handle, its cold metal sending a shock through her arm, like an electric current coursing through her veins. It was the same feeling she had had when she first turned the key to the hotel's curse. That unshakable sense that no matter what she did, no matter how far she ran, the hotel would always pull her back. She turned the handle slowly, the door creaking open with a deep, eerie groan as though it had been waiting for her all this time. The room inside was darker than it had ever been, the shadows in the corners thick and oppressive wrapping around the bed, the nightstand, the floor. But the silence was deafening. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for her to cross the threshold. And she did. Claire stepped into the room again, the familiar coldness wrapping around her like an old, uncomfortable coat. Her hands were shaking, and she couldn't tell if it was from fear or the sheer weight of what was happening. The shadows seemed to move, twisting in unnatural ways, their forms stretching and recoiling like tendrils of smoke. The presence in the room was heavy, suffocating, and it made her stomach turn. She moved toward the center of the room where the bed sat, unchanged, its twisted sheets untouched, just as it had been when she first entered the hotel. The room was alive again, the very air vibrating with something dark, something hungry. The figure that had haunted her, the figure that had taken her, was here somewhere. She could feel it. "You cannot leave." The voice echoed through her mind again, and Claire's chest tightened. She wasn't just trapped in this room. She was trapped in herself. The hotel had become a part of her, and no matter what she did, no matter how far she ran, it would follow. It would always be there like a shadow cast upon her soul. Her breath came faster, but she forced herself to look at the bed. It was waiting for her, just as it always had been. The darkness, the figure was waiting. The weight of the room pressed in on her, pulling her deeper into the shadows. "You belong to us." Claire's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms, grounding herself in the pain. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let it take her again. She had escaped before. She could do it again. With a burst of energy, Claire threw herself forward, her fingers gripping the nightstand. She yanked at it, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but it didn't matter. She had to fight back. She had to break free. The shadows were creeping in, but she would not let them win. The room shuddered. The walls shook, the very air rippling with an unnatural force. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until they became a screeching, overwhelming chorus. But Claire didn't stop. She couldn't. "You belong to us." "No." Claire whispered the words to herself, over and over, louder now. as though speaking them could make them real. She wasn't their prisoner. She wasn't their possession. She stepped toward the bed, her body moving with a purpose, determined to confront the darkness once and for all. She reached out, touching the bed. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching across the room, but she held firm. "I will not belong to you." The words were not a plea. They were a promise. The figure loomed in front of her, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness, its face a twisted mockery of herself. The figure grinned, that unsettling smile wide, but it didn't move. Claire's heart raced, but she stood her ground. She could feel the darkness pulling at her again, trying to swallow her whole, but she fought back. She stepped forward, and the figure began to fade, its edges distorting, breaking apart like smoke in the wind. "You will never escape." The voice, now a faint echo, was no longer a threat. It was a fading memory. With one last step forward, Claire reached out her fingers, brushing against the cold bedspread. The room trembled again, but this time, the shadows began to dissolve, the oppressive air lifting. The weight of the hotel, the burden it had placed on her, was slipping away, piece by piece. For the first time, she was truly free. Claire stood in the middle of the room, breathing heavily, her eyes scanning the space around her. The oppressive darkness had receded, leaving behind an eerie stillness. For the first time since she had entered the hotel, there was no pull, no whisper, no suffocating force trying to drag her back into the shadows. The room felt lighter, almost peaceful, but Claire couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't completely free yet. The air still carried the faintest remnants of coldness, the sharp sting of what had happened. The hotel had been alive in a way she hadn't understood until now. But it was gone now. The darkness was no longer holding her, no longer pressing in on her mind. Or so she thought. Claire turned toward the door, her eyes narrowing as she approached it. She reached for the handle, hesitating for just a moment. Was it truly over? Was she about to step into a new world, free of the hotel's curse? Or was this just another illusion, a fragment of the hotel's trickery? With a firm breath, she turned the handle, pushing the door open. On the other side of the door was nothing. Just an empty hallway stretching out endlessly in both directions. The walls were bare, the air cold and still. It was as though she was stepping into an entirely different place, yet somehow it felt familiar. The hotel. It was still here, just waiting, watching. Her heart skipped a beat. She could feel it, feel the weight of it, the pull of the room behind her, like it was calling her to return. Claire shook her head, taking a step back, but the hallway stretched ahead. The door now closed behind her. There was no way back. No, this was it. She couldn't let the hotel claim her again. She wouldn't let it. Claire took a step forward, each movement feeling more certain than the last. The hallway seemed to grow darker with each step, the shadows on the walls creeping along the floor, as if they had a life of their own. But Claire didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Her feet moved quickly now, the weight of the hotel's presence heavier in her chest, but the further she walked, the lighter the air felt. The farther she moved from the door, the quieter the whispers became. She walked faster, her steps becoming more confident. She was no longer running. She was walking toward her future, toward something real. "You cannot escape," the voice came again, faint and distant. But this time it didn't have the same power. Claire kept moving. She didn't look back. The hallway began to change. The walls, once stark and bare, started to warp, the colors shifting as if they were being painted in real time. The flickering lights above her seemed to stretch their glow, becoming softer and warmer. The oppressive coldness that had once permeated the hotel was now replaced with a warmth she hadn't felt in so long. Claire stopped and looked around. The hallway was no longer the bleak, dark place it had been. Now it was alive. The shadows had vanished, and the walls were painted with vivid colors, soft blues and rich browns, like the hues of a home. The air was filled with the scent of wood and fresh flowers. The flickering lights became soft chandeliers glowing gently overhead, and the floor beneath her feet felt solid, real, like the ground of a home she had never known. The hotel had become a place of peace, of solace. The oppressive darkness was gone. The whisper faded entirely. "You are free." The voice, once so commanding, now a mere whisper in the back of her mind, finally dissipated into nothing. Claire took a deep breath, and for the first time, she felt truly alive. The journey had taken everything from her, but it had also given her a strength she hadn't known she possessed. She had fought the hotel. She had fought the darkness, and she had won. She stepped forward once again, the warmth of the hallway filling her as she walked toward the end, where a door stood wide open, revealing a bright, clear sky outside. It was real. It was a new world. She wasn't looking back. The hotel room 428, the darkness, it was behind her, and Claire was free. Claire stepped through the doorway, her heart still pounding in her chest, but now with a sense of triumph, not fear. The world outside was vast, the horizon stretching endlessly before her. The sky was a perfect blue, unmarred by clouds, the sunlight warm and inviting. It felt real, so real, as if the hotel, the shadows, the twisted hallways, and the suffocating whispers had never been a part of this place. She looked down at the ground beneath her feet. The soft grass was cool against her skin, each blade swaying gently in the breeze. She could feel the weight in her chest, the remnants of the darkness that had followed her, begin to fade. It wasn't completely gone. She knew that. But it was distant now, like a lingering nightmare that had no hold on her. Claire took a deep breath, her chest filling with the fresh, untainted air of the outside world. The peace she had longed for was finally settling in. The hotel was behind her. The battle had been fought. She had won. But as her gaze shifted, Claire's eyes landed on something just ahead, a figure standing in the distance. It was barely a silhouette against the endless sky, but it was enough to freeze her in her tracks. For a moment, she thought she might be imagining it, another shadow from her past, another part of the hotel trying to trick her. But the figure remained there, unmoving, watching her. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she tried to steady her breath. She couldn't let fear take hold again. She couldn't. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving the figure in the distance. The air grew still, as though the very world around her was holding its breath. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, waiting its form, indistinguishable in the light. And yet she could feel it, the same presence, the same pull that had haunted her in the hotel. It wasn't just any figure. It was her, the same twisted reflection, the same haunting version of herself. You can never escape. The voice came again, but it wasn't the hotel's voice. It wasn't the darkness that had once claimed her. This time, it was her own, the voice that had echoed in her mind for so long. Claire stopped in her tracks, her heart hammering in her chest. Her breath caught in her throat as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this another trick? Was she being pulled back into the nightmare? The figure stepped forward slowly, deliberately. Its movements were fluid, graceful, but unnatural. The closer it got, the clearer it became. It wasn't exactly her, but it was so close. Its eyes were dark, empty, yet somehow familiar. The twisted grin spread across its face, but there was no joy, no warmth in it. Only a cold, eerie mockery of what Claire had once been. The reflection was her past, the hotel, the fear, the darkness. It was everything she had fought to escape standing before her, waiting for her to admit that it would never let her go. You belong to us. Claire's knees went weak. The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a command. The hotel's voice. Her voice. She could feel it surging through her, pushing against her will, trying to pull her back into the darkness. But this time Claire refused. She swallowed hard, steadying herself as the figure drew closer. She wasn't going to give in. Not again. She had fought too hard. She had escaped. She was free. No. She whispered the words, raw but firm. I'm not yours. I never was. Her voice echoed in the stillness of the air, ringing out against the empty landscape. The figure froze, its grin faltering the shadows around it, shuddering. You cannot escape what you are. The figure's voice was a low growl now, a reflection of the darkness inside her. Claire's breath quickened, but she didn't back down. The shadows were still trying to pull her, still tugging at her thoughts, but she had faced them before, and she would face them again. This time she wasn't running. She wasn't afraid. Claire clenched her fists, her eyes narrowing. I am not you. With that, the figure screeched its form, flickering like a broken image on a screen. The air around it trembled, the world itself seeming to bend in on itself. Claire's pulse raced, but she didn't move. She stood her ground, feeling the power of her words, the power of her defiance filling her. The figure let out one final guttural scream, the shadows around it dissolving like smoke in the wind. The light around Claire grew brighter, and for the first time she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The darkness was gone. The figure was gone, for good. Claire stood in the silence, the air still and calm around her. She closed her eyes, taking in a slow, steadying breath. When she opened them again, the figure was no longer there. The horizon stretched out before her, a place she could walk freely in, no longer tethered to the hotel or the darkness it had once consumed her with. She had fought. She had survived. And now she was truly free. Claire stood alone in the vast openness, the weight of everything she had endured sinking in. The figure, the darkness, the hotel, it was all gone. The silence now enveloped her, a silence so pure and still that it felt almost sacred. For the first time in so long, Claire felt like she could breathe freely, unburdened by the past that had clung to her every step. She took a slow, cautious step forward, her feet grounded in the soft earth beneath her. The sunlight above felt warm, its rays reaching out to her, like the embrace of something long awaited. She felt the warmth on her skin, the breeze on her face, and for a moment, Claire allowed herself to just be, to let go of the fear, the tension, the battle she had fought for so long. The land stretched out before her, an endless horizon of peace, a far cry from the suffocating, twisted hotel she had escaped from. There were no shadows, no whispers, only the hum of life, the rustling of trees, the distant chirping of birds. Everything was alive again. She closed her eyes, letting the world wash over her. The wind, the light, the earth beneath her feet, it was all real. And in this moment, Claire allowed herself to believe that it was truly over. The hotel room 428, the figure, the darkness, they were nothing but a distant memory, a part of her past that no longer held power over her. But even as she stood there bathed in sunlight, a nagging feeling tugged at the back of her mind. It was faint, just a whisper at first, but it grew louder with each passing second. Something wasn't right. Claire's heart thudded in her chest as the feeling deepened. She wasn't sure what it was, but it was there, lingering like a shadow, just beyond her vision. The peacefulness of the world around her began to crack the edges of her perception, blurring. She looked down at her hands, half expecting them to fade, to disappear like a figment of her imagination, but they remained solid, real, tangible. Her breath caught in her throat as she scanned the land around her. The trees, the grass, the sky, they were still there. But they felt wrong. They didn't belong. The peace she had just felt now felt like a fragile illusion, and the longer she stayed in it, the more she could feel the presence of something watching her. Waiting, you can never escape. The voice came again, not from behind her, but from within her own mind, a cold, echoing whisper that seemed to seep into her thoughts. Claire's blood ran cold, and she spun around, her heart racing. The world around her twisted again. The horizon flickered like a mirage, and before she could react, the land beneath her feet began to shift. The grass turned brittle, cracking beneath her, as the ground began to cave in, sinking into darkness. The peaceful world she had just stepped into shattered like glass. The figure the hotel was returning. It wasn't just a place. It was her. It had always been a part of her, and no matter how far she ran, it would always find her. You cannot escape. The whisper was louder now, swirling around her as the ground continued to collapse beneath her. Claire took a step back, panic rising in her chest. She wasn't in control anymore. The world around her was crumbling, and the darkness was closing in again, its cold fingers wrapping around her like chains. You belong to us. The figure appeared in the distance, moving slowly toward her, its form no longer just a shadow, but something real, something tangible. The air around Claire grew thick again, the suffocating presence of the hotel returning with a vengeance. She felt the pull once more, the same grip that had claimed her before. It was so strong now that it threatened to pull her apart. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Claire reached out, but it was too late. The hotel had found her again, and this time there was nowhere to run. Her hands reached toward the sky, toward the fading light, but the shadows consumed her, pulling her into the abyss. And just as she thought she might disappear into it completely, she heard a voice, soft and clear, cutting through the darkness. You are not alone. The voice wasn't her own. It wasn't the hotel's. It was something else, something new. The voice was warm, soothing, like a lifeline thrown into the storm. You are free. The shadows around her began to fade. The hotel's presence wavered, its grip loosening. Claire took a deep breath, her body finally able to move, to fight once more. The shadows receded. The light grew brighter, and Claire felt herself pulled back to the surface, to the warmth of the world outside. She was free. The light enveloped Claire like a soft, reassuring embrace. It was real. It wasn't the cold, suffocating light of the hotel, the flickering bulb that had hung above her head in room 428. It wasn't the light that twisted and warped as the shadows pulled at her. This light was different. It was warm. It was alive. And it felt like home. The air around her was calm now. The oppressive weight lifted, the crushing silence gone. The land she stood on had transformed again. The barren, cracked earth was replaced by lush green grass soft beneath her feet. The trees around her were tall and full of life, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. The sky above was bright and blue, no longer clouded by the storm of fear and darkness that had threatened to consume her. Claire took a deep breath, her lungs filling with fresh, clean air. For the first time in a long time, she felt like herself. She felt alive. Her body, which had been trembling with exhaustion and fear just moments before now, felt steady and strong. She stood tall, her chest rising and falling with each breath, and her eyes scanned the world around her. The place felt real. The grass beneath her feet was soft, the sunlight warm on her face. This was freedom. This was what she had fought for. But as she took another step forward, the nagging feeling returned. It was faint at first, like a whisper on the wind, but it grew louder, like an insistent tug at the back of her mind. She stopped and turned, scanning the horizon again. There was nothing there, just the endless landscape, the bright sky, the peaceful trees. And yet that tug, the pull of something darker, something familiar was still there. Claire shook her head, pushing the thought aside. No, she had fought too hard. She had escaped. The hotel was behind her. The darkness was gone. But then from the corner of her eye she saw it. The figure. It was standing at the edge of the trees, just barely visible in the distance, watching her. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The figure, her reflection, stood motionless, its eyes dark and hollow, its smile twisted. The same cold grin that had haunted her for so long. Her breath caught in her throat. She had thought it was over. She had thought she had broken free. But it was still there. It was always there. The hotel, the figure, the darkness, it was all inside her. You cannot escape. The voice wasn't a whisper anymore. It was clear, loud, and filled with a sense of finality. The figure moved closer, its form growing more defined, more real. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was tangible, solid, standing just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting for her. Claire's legs trembled beneath her, but she refused to give in. She wouldn't let the hotel claim her again. She had fought so hard, had given so much to escape its grasp. She had to face it. She had to confront it once and for all. The figure took another step forward, its eyes glowing faintly in the dimming light, its smile widening. But Claire didn't move. She stood her ground, her breath steadying as she prepared herself to face whatever was coming. This time she wouldn't run. She wouldn't back down. The figure stopped just in front of her, its cold breath washing over her. For a moment, everything was still, the air thick with tension. But then Claire spoke. "You are not me." Her voice was firm, stronger than she had ever felt it. She had accepted the darkness inside her once. She had allowed it to control her, to twist her. But not anymore. The figure's smile faltered, its form beginning to ripple like a reflection in a broken mirror. It shuddered, its edges blurring and distorting. Claire stood tall, her hands clenched at her sides, her eyes focused on the figure. "I am free." The figure's form cracked the shadows around it, shattering like glass. It let out a low, guttural growl, but Claire didn't flinch. She was stronger now, stronger than the darkness that had once controlled her. She had the power to break free. She had the power to stay free. With one final scream, the figure dissolved its form, evaporating into the air, the shadows fading into nothing. Claire took a deep breath. The air around her was calm again, the light warm and steady. She could still feel the remnants of the darkness inside her, but it no longer held power over her. It was part of her past, a chapter she had closed. She smiled. She was free. The world around Claire remained still quiet, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt at peace. The weight of the hotel, of the figure, of the darkness that had relentlessly pursued her, everything had dissipated. She stood alone in the open field, the wind gentle on her face, the sunlight warm and comforting. Her body, though weary, felt lighter than it ever had before. There was nothing holding her back, no shadows creeping at the edges of her vision, no whispers tugging at her mind. For the first time, she was free. But as she stood there, basking in the warmth of the sunlight, a fleeting thought drifted through her mind. Was this real? She shook her head, pushing the doubt away. She had fought so hard to get here. She had fought through the darkness, through the twisted halls of the hotel, through the reflection of her own fear. She had won. She had broken free. This place, this peaceful world around her, it was real. She was free. And yet, something still felt off. She could feel it in the air, like a subtle undercurrent she couldn't quite place. She couldn't explain it, but it lingered there just beneath the surface of her thoughts, as if the peace, the stillness was too perfect, too unshakable. It didn't fit with what she had known. Claire turned slowly, scanning the vast landscape before her. The field stretched endlessly in every direction, but there was nothing in sight. No people, no buildings, no sign of life. Just the endless, unbroken horizon. And yet, the feeling remained. She wasn't alone. She hadn't truly escaped. "You will always return," the voice echoed again, faint but unmistakable. Her pulse quickened, but she stood tall, forcing herself to focus. It was the same voice, the same whispers from before. The hotel's voice, the darkness. But she couldn't let it pull her back. Not now. Her heart raced as she took a step forward, the ground firm beneath her feet. But the shadows, though distant, were still there like a lingering presence, an itch at the back of her mind. It was a quiet hum, a subtle pull, and it was growing stronger. The air, though calm, seemed to thicken the once clear horizon, now growing clouded. No, Claire refused to let it take hold again. She couldn't go back. She couldn't let herself fall into the same trap, let the hotel claim her once more. She pressed forward, her mind focused on one thing: escape. She had fought for her freedom, and this time she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. "You cannot escape." The voice came again, louder this time, filling her mind with its cold, familiar tone. Claire shook her head, willing herself not to listen. It was a trick. The hotel had no power over her anymore. The figure, the darkness, they were all part of her past, part of the nightmare she had left behind. As she walked, the shadows seemed to stretch slowly, encroaching on her path, wrapping themselves around the edges of the world like an invisible tide coming in. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, the earth shifting, turning cold again. The once warm, inviting air now felt heavy, thick with the weight of something darker. Her breath caught in her throat as she stopped, her feet frozen to the ground. She knew what was happening. She was being pulled back in. The hotel's grip was tightening, and she could feel it like a cold hand wrapping around her chest. But she refused to go back. "I am free." Her voice was steady, louder than it had ever been. She repeated the words to herself over and over, like a mantra. She was free. The hotel no longer had power over her. The darkness no longer controlled her. With renewed strength, she moved forward. Each step felt like a battle, but she didn't falter. The shadows crept in closer, the cold air biting at her skin. But Claire kept moving, her body growing stronger with each step. The voice in her mind, the whispers, the presence. Everything was fading as she pressed on. She was breaking free. She could feel it. And then, just as the darkness reached out to swallow her whole, the world shifted again. The shadows receded, the weight lifting from her chest. The air became lighter, warmer, and the sun that had dimmed before now shone brightly once more. The land stretched out before her, vast and open, with no signs of darkness, no figures watching her. It was real. She was free. The world felt solid beneath her feet, and as she looked around, she could see the horizon clear and bright, untouched by shadows. This was her world now. This was her freedom. The hotel was behind her, its presence fading like a bad dream. Claire stood tall, her chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She was alive. She was free, and this time she would never look back. For a moment the world stood still. Claire stood at the edge of the field, the warm light of the sun glowing on her skin. Her body felt alive, the exhaustion of her long journey, finally beginning to fade, replaced by a sense of calm. She had fought so hard, faced so many horrors, and had finally broken free from the hotel's grip. The whispers were gone, the darkness had receded, and she was finally free. She was in control, but something in her chest told her to be cautious. The world around her felt too peaceful, too serene. The warmth of the sunlight felt almost like a dream. She had been through too much to let down her guard now. There was always something, some part of the hotel that lingered watching, waiting for her to let her guard down. As she stood there, the quiet, almost deafening silence settled around her. She listened, straining her ears, but there was nothing. Not a sound, not a breeze. It felt wrong. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, a dark figure emerged in the distance. It was far away at first, a distant shadow against the horizon, but Claire's heart dropped when she realized what it was. The figure. It wasn't like the one before. It wasn't the twisted reflection of herself, nor was it the shadowy presence that had stalked her throughout her journey. This figure was different. It was pure darkness. No face, no form, just an absence of light, an impenetrable void moving towards her. Her pulse quickened as the figure drew closer, the air around her growing cold again. It was moving too fast, too purposefully. "You cannot escape." The voice rang out from the figure, but it wasn't in her head this time. It was real, louder, more commanding. The same voice, but more forceful, more final. Claire's stomach churned. The whispers she thought were gone began to return, faint and distant, but growing louder, more insistent, until they were a maddening roar inside her head. She turned to run, but the world around her didn't shift like before. The horizon seemed to stretch, and the ground beneath her feet felt uneven, as if she was no longer on solid ground. The figure was coming closer, its presence spreading, blanketing everything in its path, with an unnatural coldness. "You will always return." The voice was everywhere, now echoing in the air, vibrating through her chest, consuming her thoughts. Claire couldn't breathe. The air was thick with a presence, something ancient and malicious, that had always been there, just waiting for her to falter, waiting for her to stop running. She stumbled, her feet slipping on the shifting ground, but she forced herself to stand. She couldn't let this happen again. She couldn't let the hotel pull her back in. Not after everything she had fought for. Claire looked around desperately. The landscape seemed endless, the field stretching out in every direction, but there was no way out. The figure was closing in on her with every step. She could feel its pull, the weight of it, dragging her back into the abyss. "You belong to us." Claire stopped, her breath ragged as she turned toward the figure. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Her mind raced. The hotel had always been a part of her. It had shaped her, consumed her, and now it was trying to reclaim her. But she wouldn't go back. Not again. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She had fought the darkness before, and she would do it again. She wouldn't let it take her. With every ounce of strength she had left, Claire lifted her head, staring into the void of the figure's form, and she spoke. "I am not yours." The words were stronger than they had ever been. There was no hesitation this time. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't fighting to survive. She was defying the darkness. The figure paused for a moment, as if the words had broken through the relentless pull. But then it began to move faster, the void of its presence swallowing everything in its path. "You cannot escape." But Claire wasn't listening anymore. She wasn't going to run, not this time. The darkness would not claim her again, not after everything she had faced, not after everything she had fought for. "I am free." The words rang out louder than before, and as she spoke, the darkness hesitated. For a moment, the world around her seemed to stop moving. The figure flickered. Its form warped like smoke caught in the wind. The air began to shift, the temperature rising as the darkness began to fade. Claire took another step forward, and with it, the ground beneath her feet solidified, the weight lifting from her chest. The air was lighter. The presence that had loomed over her was receding. The figure was breaking apart. "You are free." The voice, once cold and demanding, was now a whisper fading into the wind. The The shadows crumbled, disappearing like dust in the air. The world around Claire grew brighter, the colors of the landscape sharpening the sky clear and vast once more. And then the figure was gone. The hotel, the darkness was gone. For the first time, Claire was truly free. Claire stood in the stillness, her chest rising and falling with each steadying breath. The warmth of the sun on her skin, the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees, everything felt real, vibrant, alive. The weight that had crushed her for so long had finally lifted. The hotel, the figure, the whispers. They were nothing but a distant memory fading away with each passing second. She had done it. She had escaped. But as she stood there, a deep sense of unease settled over her, like a shadow that refused to fade completely. The world around her felt too quiet, too still, as though it were holding its breath. Claire's eyes scanned the landscape, taking in the vastness of the field stretching before her, the horizon endless and untouched. It should have been peaceful, but there was something in the silence, something that tugged at her, a nagging feeling she couldn't shake. Was she truly free? She had fought for her freedom, endured the darkness, and broken free of the hotel's grip. But the unease lingered. She could still feel the pull of the hotel deep within her, like an echo in her mind. The whispers, though quiet, now had never truly stopped. They had always been there, buried beneath the surface, waiting for her to falter. "You belong to us." The voice came again, but this time it was softer, as if it were calling from a distance. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if the voice was real or just the remnants of her mind playing tricks on her, but it didn't matter. She couldn't let it consume her again. She had won this time. She was free. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and moved forward. The path ahead was clear, the land stretching before her like a blank canvas. She didn't know what lay beyond the horizon, but she had made it this far. She had faced the darkness, faced the hotel's grip, and she was still standing. As she walked, the weight in her chest seemed to ease. The landscape around her grew brighter, the shadows that had once threatened to pull her back into their depths, fading into nothing. The sunlight warmed her skin, and for the first time, Claire allowed herself to believe she had truly escaped. The whispers, the shadows, they were gone. The darkness no longer had power over her. "You are free," the words echoed softly in her mind, and for the first time Claire felt the truth of them. She had faced the terror, the fear, the suffocating presence of the hotel, and she had overcome it. She was free. The path ahead seemed endless, and for the first time she was filled with hope. She could go anywhere. She could do anything. The weight of the past no longer burdened her. She kept walking, her steps growing steadier, her heart lighter with each passing moment. The sunlight bathed her in warmth, and she felt the embrace of the world around her, its beauty, its peace. She was no longer a prisoner of the hotel, no longer bound by its darkness. She was free. As she walked into the distance, the horizon growing closer with each step, Claire knew one thing for certain: she had survived. And no matter what lay ahead, she would face it on her own terms. She was free. The road ahead was long, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. Claire's steps were steady, each one more sure than the last, as if the world itself was finally aligning with her resolve. The weight that had clung to her for so long, the fear that had defined every step, had finally dissolved, leaving only the stillness of the world around her. She could hear the soft rustling of the wind in the trees, the distant chirping of birds, the hum of life continuing in its eternal rhythm. For a long time, those sounds had been drowned out by the whispers of the hotel, by the incessant pull of the darkness. But now they were the only sounds in the air, filling her with a quiet sense of peace. The land before her was endless, open, a vast expanse of green fields, rolling hills, and a sky so blue it seemed to stretch beyond comprehension. This was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of something, but the presence of everything. It was the vastness, the potential, the infinite possibilities that lay ahead. She had made it. After everything, after the hotel's relentless grip, after the figure, the shadows, the suffocating whispers, it was over. She was free. But as she walked, something tugged at her. It wasn't fear this time, nor was it the hotel's pull. It was something else, an unspoken truth. A realization that made the world around her feel different. She wasn't walking into an unknown future. She was walking out of something. The shadows were gone. The darkness receded, but it still lingered in her mind, like the echo of a haunting melody that refused to fade completely. Why? Why had she been chosen? Why had she been marked by the hotel's curse? Was it truly over? Or was the darkness always destined to find its way back to her? She pushed the thoughts aside. The light around her grew brighter with every step, and the questions in her mind began to fade with each footfall. She couldn't dwell on the past. The hotel had shaped her, yes. It had marked her. But it no longer defined her. She was free. The figure was gone. The hotel's voice no longer echoed in her mind. And even if it did, Claire was stronger now. She had fought the darkness. She had fought for her life, for her future, and nothing could take that from her now. Claire's pace quickened. She wasn't running anymore. She was walking toward something new, something she couldn't yet see, but something that was hers to claim. The world stretched out before her like a canvas, and she was ready to paint it with every color of her choosing. She glanced back one last time, but the hotel was gone. It had faded into the past where it belonged. The door had closed, the figure had dissolved into the ether, and the darkness had no more power over her. Her future was hers, and no shadow could cloud it now. With a final deep breath, Claire took the first true step into the unknown, into freedom, into life. The horizon was endless, but for the first time, Claire was no longer afraid. She smiled a smile that was hers, a smile that belonged to her, and as the sun set behind her, she walked forward free.